Welcome, brave listener, to the most chaotic, back-breaking, and absolutely terrifying job market in human history, the Stone Age. Forget resumes and forget coffee-fueled networking events here. Your promotion wasn't a corner office with a view. It was from starving to slightly less starving. Yes, your career ladder had exactly one rung, and it involved dodging saber-toothed cats, foraging for roots, and occasionally pretending you didn't hear a nearby roar. Let's set the scene. The year is roughly 10,000 BCE. Humanity is spread thin across forests, plains, and caves, armed with stone tools, bare hands, and a healthy sense of existential dread. There are no employment contracts, no minimum wage, no HR to explain why that mammoth is taking a liking to your leg. Work existed because life would otherwise hit the snooze button on your survival entirely. And make no mistake, this was work. Not hobby, not passion project, not an internship where you hope to learn something valuable. This was the relentless grind of daily existence. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why the Stone Age had the worst jobs in history, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Now, what did jobs look like in this era? You might assume that Stone Age humans simply wandered around aimlessly, like prehistoric Instagram influencers. But nope, society was already divided into functional roles, each as grueling as the last. There were hunters, the adrenaline junkies chasing death one mammoth at a time. There were gatherers, the plant specialists who had to distinguish between delicious berries and oh, that will kill you slowly berries. Toolmakers were the unsung engineers of the era, chiseling, grinding, and shaping stone, bone, and wood into implements that might just save or end someone's life. And yes, there were cleaners. Don't roll your eyes. Someone had to scrape animal entrails, collect waste, and manage living spaces. In other words, the original sanitation engineers. If you think your office cleaning job is bad, just imagine being handed a sack of rotting meat in a cave with zero ventilation and being told, your shift starts now. But before we dive into specific roles, it's important to understand the concept of work itself. Unlike modern employment, Stone Age labor wasn't measured in hours or paychecks. It was measured in survival units. Did you eat today? Did you avoid becoming lunch? Did your shelter withstand last night's storm? Your performance review was a brutally honest cosmic system, live or die. And promotions? Well, let's just say they were life-affirming. One day you're cold, wet, and slightly hungry. The next day you've managed to catch dinner without losing a limb. Congratulations, you're officially slightly less miserable than yesterday. And honestly, in this world that counted as a win. Another key difference between then and now, there was no specialization beyond necessity. Modern jobs might sound impressive. Software engineer, pilot, dentist. Stone Age roles were brutal, multi-dimensional, and occasionally terrifying. A hunter didn't just hunt. They also had to know how to set traps, track animals, and improvise a first aid kit made of sticks and moss when things inevitably went wrong. A gatherer didn't just pick berries. They also had to identify medicinal plants, avoid poisonous mushrooms, and sometimes defend themselves from small, vicious predators. Even cleaners had more survival responsibilities than a janitor on steroids. They were responsible for hygiene, which literally meant life or death, and for preventing disease from wiping out their small band of humans. Every job was critical, high stakes, and performed under constant existential pressure. Basically, it was like working in a startup run by Mother Nature, where deadlines were predators and budgets were non-existent. Now, humor aside, understanding these roles gives us insight into how early humans managed to survive and eventually thrive. It's easy to look back and imagine Stone Age humans as wandering primitives, but these roles show remarkable organization and adaptability. Work wasn't optional. It was an integral part of societal structure, even if society itself was small, nomadic, and prone to getting eaten. Every job, no matter how messy, dangerous, or tedious, contributed to the tribe's overall survival. In other words, prehistoric employment wasn't just work, it was the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming a cautionary tale for future generations. And speaking of humor, it's worth pausing for a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of this era's job satisfaction. Forget team-building retreats or free donuts at the office, your incentive was simple: don't die today. And if you did survive, maybe you earned a slightly fatter slice of mammoth meat, or a chance to brag that you didn't fall into the river while fetching water. That was your bonus. And yet, despite the misery, humans persevered, proving that even the worst jobs in history couldn't break the species that would eventually build pyramids, write novels, and complain about paperwork in air-conditioned offices. So as we kick off this exploration of Stone Age employment, remember this: these jobs were not designed to be comfortable or convenient. They were designed to keep humans alive, and in that sense they were surprisingly effective. The bad news: they were brutal, exhausting, and occasionally fatal. The good news: you're not doing them. Your only worry is maybe stepping on a Lego or spilling coffee on your keyboard. Compared to dodging saber-toothed cats and hauling mammoth bones across uneven terrain, your 9 to 5 suddenly feels like a luxury cruise. If you thought your job was dangerous because of angry clients or tight deadlines, welcome to the Stone Age's premier hazard pay position: hunter. This wasn't a leisurely stroll through a supermarket, or even a casual game of archery at the local fair. This was life or death employment, and the animals were the ones doing the hiring and occasionally firing. The good news? You might bag dinner. The bad news? Dinner might bag you first. Hunting in the Stone Age was equal parts strategy, stamina, and sheer luck. Early humans didn't have rifles, trucks, or refrigerated storage. Their arsenal consisted of stone-tipped spears, wooden clubs, bone knives, and an impressive set of teeth and claws. Theirs, not the animals. Every expedition began with careful preparation. You couldn't just wander into the forest and hope for the best. You had to track animals, study their habits, understand their weaknesses, and predict their movements. Basically, you were part detective, part athlete, and part amateur stunt double, because sometimes surviving meant leaping over a cliff to escape something bigger and faster than you. And speaking of faster and bigger, the prey wasn't exactly cooperative. Mammoths, bison, wild boar, and giant deer didn't politely stand in line for you to stab them. They charged, trampled, and occasionally gored hunters to death. One misstep, and the hunter became the hunted. In fact, fossil records indicate that many Stone Age injuries were exactly what you'd expect from someone trying to negotiate with a 1,500-pound animal with tusks. Broken bones, punctured lungs, and missing digits were common occupational hazards. There was no workers' comp, no sick leave, and certainly no HR department to file a complaint. Survival itself was the review process. Hunting also demanded insane amounts of patience. You couldn't rush it. Animals were unpredictable. Some days, you'd spend hours lying in a pit, crouched behind a bush, holding a spear that weighed as much as a small child, only to have your prey wander off in a direction you didn't anticipate. And then there were the weather conditions. Rain, snow, and sweltering heat didn't pause for your convenience. A successful hunt might require wading through icy rivers, crawling across muddy terrain, or climbing rocks while balancing your spear like a medieval javelin champion. And of course there was the smell. Hunters often smelled like wet fur, mud, and raw meat for days or weeks, because hygiene was optional and survival was not. Perfume hadn't been invented, and frankly it would have been wasted money in a cave full of predators. Now let's talk strategy. Hunting wasn't just about brute force, it was about brains. Early humans developed traps, ambushes, and group tactics that could rival modern military maneuvers, except with more bleeding and fewer spreadsheets. Pitfalls covered with branches, snares made of twisted vines, and coordinated drives to stampede animals toward waiting hunters were all standard techniques. Hunters needed acute observational skills, noticing tracks, understanding animal behavior, and predicting movement patterns. One small misjudgment, like misreading the wind direction, could blow your cover, and suddenly the lion chasing your dinner is also chasing you. Hunters also had to master the art of improvisation. Stone Age tools were crude and could break at the worst possible moment. If a spear snapped mid-charge or a bowstring frayed, you couldn't call the hardware store. You had to think fast, maybe fight bare-handed, or retreat and risk the scorn of your fellow tribe members. There was also the ever-present moral dilemma. Some days, hunger forced hunters to make tough choices about what animals to kill and what to leave alone. Yes, ethics existed, kind of, mostly in the form of don't die before your next meal. It wasn't all suffering, though. Hunting also offered status. Bagging a large animal meant food for your tribe and prestige for you. Successfully bringing down a mammoth wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. I am capable, brave, and possibly insane, but mostly capable. A successful hunter might gain respect, mates, or influence within the group. And let's be honest, bragging rights in the Stone Age were invaluable. Unfortunately, the downside was that with prestige came expectation. You were expected to hunt again and again in increasingly risky conditions. The job never ended. Finally, hunting demanded resilience and emotional fortitude. You needed the mental toughness to witness death, both animal and human, and continue the work the next day. Stone Age hunters couldn't take a mental health day, and the stress of surviving constant danger was enormous. Yet somehow, they did it. They adapted, learned from failure, and innovated new techniques, leaving a legacy that would eventually allow humans to dominate almost every environment on Earth. So, when you complain about your last corporate team-building retreat, remember this. Hunters in the Stone Age woke up every morning with one task and one task only. Don't become someone else's dinner today. They carried tools that could kill or maim, faced predators who were faster, stronger, and angrier, and spent weeks smelling like a wet dog for the sake of a meal. If that isn't dedication, I don't know what is. In conclusion, the hunter's life was equal parts thrill, terror, and grotesque labor. It was dangerous, exhausting, and often fatal, yet it shaped human evolution, innovation, and survival skills in ways that modern desk jobs will never touch. The next time you sip your latte and grumble about your commute, spare a thought for your Stone Age ancestors, because hunting wasn't just a job, it was a full-contact, multi-hour, high-risk, smell-infused battle with nature itself. If hunters were the adrenaline junkies of the Stone Age, gatherers were the meticulous, slightly paranoid grocery specialists of prehistory. While the hunter risked being trampled or gored, the gatherer faced a subtler but no less deadly threat: plants. Yes, plants. That seemingly innocent berry could be sweet heaven or a one-way ticket to the underworld. Breakfast could kill you, literally, and lunch, also a gamble. Gathering might sound like a relaxing walk in the woods with a wicker basket and a carefree attitude, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Every step required caution, every bite was a calculated risk, and every decision could have fatal consequences. Imagine being a Stone Age nutritionist with zero formal training, armed only with observation, trial and error, and possibly a strong sense of hope. You couldn't rely on labels, expiration dates, or online reviews. You had to know instinctively what was edible, what was mildly unpleasant, and what was deadly. And if you guessed wrong, well, let's just say vomiting and hallucinations were only the beginning. The skill set for gathering was surprisingly sophisticated. First, you needed a keen eye. Many edible plants looked strikingly similar to poisonous ones. A handful of red berries could mean energy for the tribe, or a stomach-turning, often fatal experiment. Some mushrooms were delicious, others were microscopic assassins disguised as fungal delights. The difference between a nutritious tuber and a root that could shut down your kidneys often came down to subtle cues: the color of a leaf, the shape of a stem, or the soil in which it grew. Mistakes were unforgiving, and the margin for error was microscopic. But being a gatherer wasn't just about picking the right food, it was about timing. Plants had seasons, and knowing when and where they were ripe was crucial. Too early, and you risked poisonous compounds. Too late, and they were overripe, infested with insects or already claimed by rival tribes or worse by a pack of prehistoric scavengers. Gatherers needed a calendar in their heads, a deep understanding of the ecosystem, and nerves of steel to stoop over a bush for hours while swatting away insects that seemed determined to crawl into the same basket. And let's not forget the terrain. Gatherers weren't strolling along manicured paths. They crawled through thorny underbrush, balanced on slick riverbanks, and navigated rocky hillsides. You could sprain an ankle on a hidden route, get scratched by brambles, or accidentally encounter a territorial animal. Bears, wolves, and venomous snakes didn't exactly appreciate visitors rummaging through their pantry. Gatherers had to be agile, cautious, and ready to flee, or, if necessary, fight with a stick. Not to mention the elements were relentless. Rain turned paths into mudslides, sun caused dehydration, and frost made every berry hunting trip a test of endurance. Despite all this, gatherers were often undervalued compared to hunters. Bring back a few roots or some nuts, and the tribe might nod politely. Bring back a mammoth and you were celebrated for weeks. Yet gatherers were the backbone of Stone Age survival. Without them, hunters starved regardless of skill or bravery. A large animal might feed a few people for a couple of days, but a well-stocked cache of nuts, berries, and roots could sustain an entire tribe for weeks. In other words, the gatherer's job was less glamorous, more repetitive, and required incredible knowledge of nature, but it was no less critical. Gatherers also played a subtle role in shaping human innovation. Their knowledge of plants laid the groundwork for early medicine, spices, and eventually agriculture, which means every berry they risked eating wasn't just feeding the tribe, it was contributing to human progress. All the while, they suffered cuts, scratches, insect bites, and occasional poisonings, quietly, heroically, without the thrill of spear chasing or roaring crowds of admiring peers. There was also a physical endurance aspect to gathering. Carrying baskets of heavy roots, climbing trees for nuts, and trekking miles for water-rich plants wasn't easy. They were the original multitaskers, balancing loads, scouting for danger, and continuously monitoring their surroundings, all while thinking, I hope this isn't poisonous. And let's be honest, there was an element of sensory overload, the constant smell of wet soil, the buzzing of insects, the occasional rotting carcass nearby, all part of a day's work in the Stone Age supermarket. Yet, despite the dangers, the monotony, and the lack of recognition, gatherers adapted. They learned plant cycles, experimented cautiously with new foods, and developed techniques to store and preserve what they found. They were the unsung heroes who made sure survival didn't depend solely on luck or brute strength. And they did it day after day with a combination of intelligence, patience, and sheer stubbornness, all while the hunters returned with stories of chasing mammoths and avoiding death in thrilling, albeit terrifying encounters. So while hunters got the glory, gatherers got the real responsibility. They were the ones ensuring that when the tribe woke up, there was food to chew, not just a grisly memory of a failed hunt. They turned the wilderness into a larder and survived, despite the odds, teaching humans one important lesson. Survival isn't always about bravery. It's about smarts, caution, and the ability to tell a poisonous berry from a perfectly safe one. Breakfast might kill you. Lunch might be a gamble, but thanks to the gatherers, the tribe kept living long enough to tell the story. If hunters were the adrenaline junkies and gatherers the cautious strategists of the Stone Age, toolmakers were the overworked engineers, whose job definition basically read, if you screw this up, everyone starves or dies. Making stone axes, scrapers, arrowheads, and other implements may sound like a hobby for crafty hobbyists today, but in the Stone Age, it was a full-time, hand-cramping, eye-straining, soul-testing labor of necessity. Tool-making was less about artistry and more about precision under brutal conditions. Every rock had potential, but not every rock was suitable. Selecting a piece of flint or chert required knowledge of its hardness, brittleness, and fracture patterns. Smash it too hard, and the tool shattered before it could be useful. Hit it too softly, and you wasted precious hours and possibly fingers on a useless shard. The process demanded immense patience, unwavering concentration, and a willingness to develop calluses in places you didn't even know existed. Your hands could feel like they'd been pounded by a miniature tribal blacksmith hammer, and your eyes, well, they ached from squinting at sharp, glinting edges for hours on end. Stone Age toolmakers also had to be creative problem solvers. Early humans didn't have uniform supplies or instruction manuals. There was no YouTube tutorial for how to make a perfect arrowhead that doesn't shatter on impact. Every tool had to be custom fit to a task: cutting meat, scraping hides, digging roots, or fending off predators. A poorly made scraper could leave an animal hide full of holes, a jagged spear could break mid-thrust, and a dull axe could turn a simple chopping job into a battle with a stubborn log. Imagine trying to build a functional object from scratch, with one false move potentially ending the tribe's dinner or your career. The labor itself was exhausting and repetitive. Knapping, a technique involving striking one rock against another to shape it, required dozens, sometimes hundreds of precise blows per item. Sparks flew, shards flew, and occasionally the toolmaker's knuckles flew too, thanks to misjudged swings. And this work didn't come with a satisfying reward at the end of a single day. A successful spear could take hours or even days, and by the time you finished, your neighbors might invent fire and render your labor somewhat obsolete. Imagine chiseling a rock for hours, only to have someone demonstrate that you could cook meat on a flame rather than stab it repeatedly. Thanks, genius. Now my tool feels unnecessary. But despite the monotony and physical toll, tool making was absolutely critical to survival. Hunters depended on sharp spears and arrows. Gatherers needed sturdy digging implements and scrapers to process roots and hides. Without tools, the tribe would be left vulnerable, unable to kill effectively, unable to prepare food, and unable to defend themselves. In other words, toolmakers didn't just shape rocks, they shaped the tribe's entire chance at staying alive. A flawed tool could mean a wasted hunt, spoiled food, or even injury. Their work may have lacked the glamour of battle, but its consequences were no less severe. Interestingly, toolmakers also contributed to early human innovation. Techniques improved over generations. Flint knapping got more sophisticated, stone axes became more efficient, and eventually humans began experimenting with composite tools, combining stone, wood, and bone. Toolmakers were the original inventors, though they rarely got recognition. While a hunter might receive praise for bringing down dinner, the toolmaker's success was invisible until a spear broke mid-hunt, and suddenly everyone remembered who had done a poor job last week. Their reward? Mostly fatigue and calloused hands, but also the subtle pride of knowing that without their labor, the tribe would struggle to survive at all. The job also carried unique hazards. Sharp stones, repeated blows, and flying debris could injure fingers, wrists, or eyes. One slip of a rock and you might have a deep gash or a permanently damaged hand. Yet despite the danger and tedium, toolmakers had to maintain focus because every flaw could have deadly consequences down the line. A cracked spearhead could deflect on impact, a poorly sharpened knife could ruin a hide, and a weak axe could bounce harmlessly off a tree while your tribe's shelter construction slows to a crawl. Accuracy wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival requirement. And let's not forget the mental endurance required. For hours, toolmakers worked in silence, hunched over stones, adjusting angles, striking repeatedly, all while imagining what the final product would look like and praying it wouldn't shatter at the first trial. This combination of physical strain and mental stress created a job that was in every sense of the word grueling. Yet the toolmaker persisted, because failure wasn't just a personal inconvenience, it could ripple through the tribe, impacting hunters, gatherers, and everyone dependent on reliable implements for survival. Finally, toolmaking was about legacy. Each stone tool carried the fingerprint of its maker, a subtle signature preserved across centuries if it survived. These artifacts tell us today that Stone Age humans were not only practical and ingenious, but capable of patience, problem-solving, and forward-thinking in a world that often punished the weak and rewarded the careful. While the hunter may get glory and the gatherer gets sustenance, the toolmaker quietly ensured that humanity could continue. one chipped rock at a time. So, next time you pick up a kitchen knife or a screwdriver, spare a thought for the toolmakers of 10,000 BCE. They labored in silence, with aching hands, strained eyes, and an endless parade of stubborn rocks, all to ensure that their tribe could survive another day. Their work was repetitive, dangerous, and often unappreciated, but it was absolutely indispensable. And let's be honest, imagining them muttering under their breath as fire made some of their tools obsolete adds a nice touch of relatable workplace frustration. If there was a Stone Age job that could simultaneously make you indispensable, miserable, and perpetually covered in soot, it was being the firekeeper. Unlike hunters who ventured out for the thrill and danger, or gatherers who crouched in bushes contemplating edible berries, the firekeeper's responsibility was deceptively simple. Keep the fire alive. That's it. One task. Every day. Every hour. No days off. No vacations. No mental health breaks. Just fire, smoke, and existential dread. Maintaining fire was the backbone of the tribe's survival. Fire provided warmth in bitter cold, light in endless darkness, a method to cook otherwise inedible food, and a way to scare off predators that might have considered humans a convenient snack. But controlling fire wasn't like flicking a lighter or pushing a button on a stove. This was raw, unpredictable, potentially lethal energy that had to be coaxed, nurtured, and constantly supervised. One stray ember, one gust of wind, and hours of careful tending could vanish in a second, leaving the tribe shivering, hungry, and slightly panicked. The physical toll on firekeepers was enormous. Their shoulders ached from carrying bundles of wood and kindling over uneven terrain. Arms and backs strained as they maintained constant stacks of fuel, shoveling and organizing it like prehistoric weightlifters. Their eyes burned from incessant smoke exposure, leaving a permanent haze over their vision. And there was no escape. You couldn't just duck into a cafe for a latte while the flames sputtered. No lunch breaks, no coffee, just smoke, soot, and the terrifying thought that fire might leave you cold. Even nighttime offered little respite. Fire needed attention at all hours, and a distracted moment could mean losing the warmth that kept the tribe alive through icy nights. Maintaining fire also demanded constant vigilance. Unlike modern flames, which are often contained and predictable, Stone Age fire could flare unpredictably. Dry wind could spark a massive blaze, rain could threaten to extinguish it, and wandering animals or careless humans could compromise its stability. The firekeeper had to monitor these variables continuously, adjusting the intensity, adding fuel in measured amounts, and ensuring the flames remained steady. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even fun. It was an exhausting exercise in attention span, endurance, and low-level panic. There was also a social component to this job. While hunters returned to accolades or gatherers quietly stored their fruits of labor, firekeepers were mostly invisible until the flame died. Then, suddenly, they were everyone's least favorite person in the world. Imagine sitting down for a cold, raw dinner, realizing your warm cave has turned into an Arctic chamber, and staring accusingly at the only person responsible for preventing this catastrophe. The firekeeper's work was simultaneously crucial and unappreciated, a combination that modern employees might recognize in a frustratingly familiar way. But let's not underestimate the skill involved. Maintaining fire required more than brute strength. It demanded understanding the material properties of different types of wood and kindling, how to start a flame from friction or spark, and how to regulate the heat for cooking without scorching the food or burning the cave down. A good firekeeper could roast a mammoth leg to perfection while keeping the tribe warm and predators at bay. A bad one, you guessed it, raw meat, frozen toes, and a bear or two knocking at the entrance. Interestingly, firekeepers were also early innovators. They experimented with ways to transport embers, protect flames during storms, and maximize fuel efficiency. Some devised clever ways to bank the fire overnight, keeping a controlled flame smoldering to be reignited in the morning. Others figured out how to create sparks with flint or specialized tools, essentially becoming the original chemists and engineers of prehistoric survival. Yet, despite these innovations, the work remained relentless. A fire isn't a static object you build once and leave. It's alive, demanding attention, effort, and constant care. The mental endurance required for this job cannot be overstated. Firekeepers needed patience, foresight, and a degree of paranoia just to survive. They couldn't afford to relax even for a moment. Their entire day was consumed by the knowledge that failure meant exposure, hunger, and danger for themselves and their tribe. Imagine being responsible for the comfort and survival of everyone around you, while inhaling smoke, lifting wood, and trying to prevent a prehistoric inferno. That is dedication by any standard. Despite the challenges, firekeepers had an undeniable impact. They enabled cooking, which made food safer and more nutritious, extending the tribe's health and longevity. They provided warmth that allowed humans to inhabit colder climates. They scared off predators, giving other members of the tribe the freedom to hunt, gather, and sleep without constant threat. Essentially, they were the unsung guardians of daily survival. Without firekeepers, the Stone Age experience would have been far shorter, far colder, and far less appetizing. In conclusion, firekeeping in the Stone Age was a grueling, monotonous, and often thankless task, yet it was indispensable. The firekeeper carried the weight of survival on smoke-stained shoulders, constantly balancing danger, exhaustion, and social invisibility. The next time you flick a switch for warmth, light, or to boil water, spare a thought for these tireless, soot-covered heroes. They didn't have a thermostat, an on-demand flame, or even a day off. They had skill, stamina, and the singular responsibility of keeping humanity's first flame alive. And for that, they deserve far more recognition than history ever gave them, or at least a lifetime supply of fireproof gloves. If you thought your least favorite job was cleaning the office bathroom, congratulations. You're living the dream compared to the Stone Age equivalent, the sanitation specialist, affectionately known in this narrative as Poop Patrol. Yes, in a time when disease lurked behind every corner and waste piled up faster than a mammoth herd on the move, someone had to take responsibility for keeping the living area at least semi-tolerable. The good news? You're helping the tribe. The bad news? You're touching the tribe's butt, and probably a lot more than that. Sanitation in the Stone Age wasn't a casual chore. It was an essential survival strategy, often assigned to the physically strongest, or in some unfortunate cases, the socially expendable. Living spaces, whether caves, temporary shelters, or makeshift huts, quickly became repositories for human and animal waste, leftover food, and other biohazards. The smell alone could make a Stone Age human reconsider every life choice leading up to that moment. The presence of pathogens meant that neglecting hygiene wasn't merely unpleasant, it could be fatal. Typhoid, dysentery, parasitic infections, these were invisible predators that could sweep through a tribe faster than a pack of wolves. Poop Patrol wasn't just cleaning. They were fighting microbial wars with nothing but sticks, leaves, and determination. Daily life for a sanitation worker involved constant vigilance. Animal dung had to be relocated or buried to prevent contamination of water and food. Leftover food scraps needed removal before they attracted insects or worse, rats, which in turn could carry diseases. Floors had to be swept, living surfaces scraped, and occasionally bedding replaced. All of this while contending with dirt, mud, and bodily fluids, because the Stone Age was not known for comfort or modern plumbing. Imagine kneeling in a cave for hours, scooping, scraping, and hauling excrement, knowing that one slip could mean touching something warm, wet, and deeply unpleasant. Yet this was a job that directly influenced the tribe's survival. One sanitation lapse could result in widespread illness, and illness in a small group of humans living in precarious conditions could be catastrophic. Poop Patrol required a surprisingly diverse skill set. You had to understand how waste decomposed, how to locate the safest disposal areas, and how to manage animal enclosures without getting trampled or bitten. Observation skills were critical. You needed to notice the earliest signs of contamination, potential disease vectors, and overcrowding of animals. Strength and endurance were essential, because hauling compost, carrying water to clean areas, and digging latrines were physically demanding. And a thick skin, both literally and figuratively, was mandatory. You could not faint at the sight of a particularly alarming pile of excrement. This job demanded professionalism under pressure, a sort of prehistoric hazmat attitude. The mental toll cannot be overstated. Poop patrol workers had to reconcile the inherent disgust of the task with the undeniable fact that the tribe's health and safety depended on them. Their work was thankless, invisible, and often socially isolating, unlike hunters, whose triumphs were loudly celebrated, or firekeepers, who gained quiet respect. Sanitation workers rarely received acknowledgement unless a crisis occurred. If disease broke out, fingers pointed. If the area stayed relatively clean, the tribe simply assumed it had always been that way. Yet without these tireless sanitation efforts, the tribe's survival rate would have plummeted. One of the most fascinating aspects of Stone Age sanitation was its ingenuity. Poop patrol didn't have modern waste disposal systems, so they relied on natural strategies, digging pits for waste, using ash and leaves to cover soiled areas, and separating human living zones from animal pens. They innovated ways to prevent contamination of water sources, often placing refuse downstream or away from drinking areas. This basic understanding of hygiene and disease prevention is remarkable, considering that germ theory wouldn't be formally recognized for tens of thousands of years. In effect, sanitation workers were the first public health specialists, armed only with common sense, natural materials, and the willingness to endure the grossest of work. And let's not forget the humorously grim social dynamics. Being assigned poop patrol likely came with a mix of awe, fear, and gentle mockery from the rest of the tribe. You were the one dealing with the stuff nobody wanted to talk about, the unseen hero maintaining life while everyone else enjoyed the benefits. And if you complained, well, too bad. Failure meant disease, and disease meant a lot of angry, sickly people looking for someone to blame. Humor was probably one of the coping mechanisms, joking about the nastiness of the work, exaggerating tales of how disgusting one pile was, and sharing stories to make the task more bearable. In conclusion, sanitation in the Stone Age was arguably the worst job imaginable, but it was also among the most critical. Without poop patrol, a single illness could wipe out a tribe in days. Their work required physical strength, intelligence, observational skill, and the ability to endure extreme disgust, all while receiving little recognition. Yet through this unglamorous labor they safeguarded the health, survival, and continuity of early human society. So next time you complain about scrubbing the bathroom at home, remember at least you're not managing animal waste in the dark, cold, and crowded living space of a prehistoric tribe. And thanks to these unsung heroes, humanity survived long enough to invent toilets, soap, and maybe even scented candles, luxuries no Stone Age worker could ever have dreamed of. If you think your morning commute is rough, try walking several miles with a heavy container of water while simultaneously dodging predators, slippery rocks, and the occasional grumpy tribe member. Welcome to the Stone Age world of water fetchers, the original delivery service, minus the tips, flexible hours, or any kind of ergonomic design. It's not hydration, it's slavery disguised as civic duty. And yet, despite the misery, this job was absolutely essential for survival. Water fetchers were responsible for ensuring that every tribe member had enough of the clear, life-sustaining liquid to drink, cook, clean, and survive. In a world without plumbing, pumps, or even buckets with handles, this was a physically brutal task. Water had to be collected from rivers, streams, lakes, or occasionally wells, often miles away from the settlement. Then the fetcher had to carry it back, usually in rudimentary containers made from animal hides, hollowed-out logs, or large shells. Imagine hauling that weight over uneven terrain, balancing precariously on slippery rocks, and hoping the vessel doesn't leak or spill en route. The task demanded not just brute strength, but careful planning and coordination to minimize losses. One of the most challenging aspects of this job was the sheer repetition. Every day the fetcher walked the same perilous paths, carrying increasingly heavy loads and dealing with natural obstacles, muddy banks, thorny plants, swarming insects, and sometimes even aggressive wildlife. Crocodiles, snakes, and territorial predators weren't exactly thrilled to see humans approaching their water supply. A misstep could result in a deadly encounter, a soaked human, and a spoiled day's work. Unlike hunters, where risk could be thrilling or adrenaline-fueled, water fetchers faced persistent, low-level danger, an unending slog where one miscalculated step could ruin your entire morning. The physical demands were enormous. Think about carrying tens of liters of water on your back or in a crude container, walking uphill, across rivers, or over rocky terrain. Your shoulders ached, your back screamed, and your legs grew weary, all while maintaining balance and focus. Repeated trips per day meant that exhaustion was a constant companion, and any weakness or lapse could endanger both the fetcher and the tribe members relying on the water. And unlike modern hydration, you couldn't just take a sip from a roadside fountain. The water had to survive the journey intact, uncontaminated, and in sufficient quantity. But water fetching wasn't just a labor-intensive task. It shaped the way Stone Age communities were organized. Tribes had to coordinate who went for water, how often, and which sources were safe. This meant early forms of scheduling, communal labor planning, and even territorial agreements over prime water locations. Fetchers weren't just workers. They were vital nodes in a complex logistical network that ensured everyone had access to life's most essential resource. The efficiency of water collection could directly impact survival, especially in dry seasons or arid climates where mistakes could mean dehydration or famine. There was also a strategic element to the job. Experienced water fetchers knew which routes were safest, how to avoid predators, and how to transport water most efficiently. They understood which containers held up best under heavy loads, how to stabilize a vessel while climbing rocky inclines, and how to judge water quality to avoid contamination. One misjudged sip or faulty container could lead to illness, spreading disease through the tribe, a risk that made water fetchers early experts in both logistics and public health. Socially, the role was grueling and underappreciated. Hunters got glory, gatherers provided food, firekeepers kept everyone warm. But water fetchers? They were essential yet invisible until someone complained about thirst or fainted from dehydration. Their toil was taken for granted, which in a sense mirrors many essential jobs even in modern societies. Humor and camaraderie may have softened the mental strain, trading exaggerated stories about river monsters, complaining about slippery banks, or joking about who spilled the most water that week. But the workload remained relentless. Despite its hardships, water fetching contributed to the development of critical human skills. It encouraged physical endurance, problem-solving, and early logistical thinking. Organizing repeated collection trips, transporting heavy loads, avoiding environmental hazards, and ensuring equitable distribution all required mental and social intelligence. These lessons in planning, efficiency, and hazard management would echo through generations, influencing how early communities structured themselves and collaborated for survival. In conclusion, water fetchers were the unsung backbone of Stone Age society. They carried not just water, but the weight of the tribe's survival on their backs, literally. The job demanded physical strength, endurance, intelligence, and constant vigilance, all while remaining largely invisible to those who benefited most. Next time you fill a glass from a tap, spare a thought for the original delivery service, the tireless, muddy, exhausted yet indispensable water fetchers who made sure humanity stayed alive long enough to invent plumbing, pumps, and modern hydration luxuries. Without them, your ancestors might have been a lot thirstier and a lot angrier than history records. If you've ever thought your job was tedious, imagine spending hours, days, or even weeks crouched in a damp cave, painting animals on walls with nothing but crushed minerals and spit. Welcome to the life of the Stone Age cave painter, the original Etsy seller, except your audience is largely unseen. The workspace smells like mildew, and every fall from a precarious rock ledge is a serious career-ending risk. Your masterpiece may last 10,000 years, but you won't, because climbing on rocks is exhausting. Cave painters weren't creating art for fun, leisure, or personal fulfillment. This was work intertwined with survival, communication, and ritual. Their canvases were cave walls, their brushes were sticks, bones, or bundles of hair, and their paint came from ground minerals like ochre, hematite, and charcoal, often mixed with saliva or animal fat to make it stick. Applying these pigments wasn't just messy, it could be hazardous. Grinding minerals into powder released fine dust which could irritate lungs and eyes, leading to persistent coughing, watery eyes, and a general sense of prehistoric misery. And if you think your office is uncomfortable, try working in a cave where the ceiling is inches from your head, the floor is slippery with mud, and you're balancing precariously while painting a bison or mammoth that needs perfect proportion. The physical demands of cave painting were brutal. Many significant cave murals are located high above the ground, requiring painters to construct makeshift scaffolds from rocks, logs, and whatever was handy. Climbing, kneeling, and contorting your body into impossible positions for hours was not unusual. Your back ached, your knees screamed, and your arms felt like they were being stretched beyond human capacity. Repetition compounded the strain, creating dozens of figures, carefully outlining each detail, shading with crushed pigments, and ensuring consistency across large surfaces was monotonous, exhausting, and frankly slightly maddening. Yet despite the discomfort, cave painters played a crucial societal role. Their work wasn't decorative in the modern sense. It was communicative, ritualistic, and symbolic. These paintings often depicted animals important for hunting, mythological scenes, or spiritual rituals. They conveyed information about migration patterns, successful hunts, and communal beliefs. In essence, they were storytelling devices, educational tools, and sacred records all at once. The Stone Age didn't have books, Instagram, or memes. They had cave paintings, and without them, important knowledge and cultural continuity might have been lost. There was also a fascinating level of skill involved. Stone Age painters needed an acute understanding of perspective, proportion, and anatomy to make their animals recognizable. They experimented with shading, line thickness, and natural contours of the cave walls to achieve dynamic effects. They were early visual communicators, capable of encoding complex ideas into symbols that other humans could read and often decode thousands of years later. In short, they were the proto-graphic designers, educators, and historians of their time. The social dynamic of cave painting was unique as well. Painters often worked in small groups, sharing knowledge of pigment preparation techniques and composition. Apprenticeship likely played a role, with experienced artists teaching novices the correct ways to apply paint and safely navigate treacherous cave surfaces. Collaboration was essential. One misstep could ruin a mural, and a fall could injure someone who might have been critical to the project. In addition, the paintings were often ceremonial. Producing them may have required adherence to specific traditions or ritual schedules, adding pressure to both the physical and mental aspects of the job. Cave painters also demonstrated early forms of legacy building. Unlike hunters or gatherers whose achievements were fleeting, an animal killed or a root gathered disappears quickly, the murals endured. Artists knew that their work might be seen by future generations long after they were gone. This desire to create something permanent, to communicate beyond one's lifetime, was revolutionary. It was an acknowledgement that humans could transcend their immediate survival and aspire to cultural immortality. The irony, of course, is that while the murals might last for tens of thousands of years, the painter likely spent days covered in dust, cramped in awkward positions, and smelling faintly of mineral pigment and animal fat. Humor, however, was likely a coping mechanism. Imagine discussing the latest trends in prehistoric art, while precariously balanced on a pile of rocks, whispering to your fellow painters about who spilled red ochre down the wall, or joking that your next masterpiece would be a tribute to the one that almost fell on your head. Humor, camaraderie, and the occasional exaggeration of mishaps probably helped offset the mental and physical fatigue, keeping painters motivated to continue despite the harsh conditions. In conclusion, cave painters were the Stone Age version of artists, educators, communicators, and ritual specialists, all rolled into one exhausting, messy, and dangerous role. They combined physical endurance, creativity, and symbolic intelligence to produce work that shaped their tribe's culture, preserved knowledge, and inspired awe for generations to come. They were underappreciated in their time, misunderstood by outsiders, and yet critical to the survival and cultural evolution of early humans. So next time you marvel at prehistoric cave art, spare a thought for the painter, crouched, dusty and exhausted, yet leaving a legacy that would literally stand the test of time. If you think modern childcare is challenging, spare a thought for the Stone Age babysitter. These early childcare specialists had one of the toughest jobs in the tribe, keeping tiny humans alive, fed and relatively sane, all while juggling the endless demands of survival. Unlike today's daycare centers, there were no structured schedules, nap times or safety regulations. There were just infants, toddlers and small children who could cry, crawl, or wander into deadly situations at any moment. They scream, they poop, they bite, but hey, at least they don't have bosses. Babysitters were responsible not only for the children themselves, but also for the ripple effects of childcare across the tribe. In a world where every member's survival depended on coordination, distraction from survival tasks could be catastrophic. Imagine trying to forage, hunt, maintain a fire, or fetch water while a toddler crawls toward a predator, chews on poisonous plants, or somehow manages to smear berries in every conceivable crevice of the cave. Babysitters had to be alert at all times, multitasking to a degree that would make any modern parent's head spin. Sleep deprivation was a given. Naps were a luxury that happened only when everyone else was asleep, and even then, a small child's cry could yank the caregiver awake, heart racing, ready to spring into action. The physical demands were intense, carrying children over long distances, sometimes while simultaneously transporting tools, food or water was routine. The strain on the body was compounded by the constant need to crouch, bend, or kneel to interact safely with little humans. Every step required vigilance, a rock here, a thorn there. A sudden slip could result in injury for both babysitter and child. And unlike modern strollers, baby carriers, or playgrounds, Stone Age childcare relied on raw physical strength, balance, and stamina. Some babysitters even had to manage multiple children at once, orchestrating a sort of mobile daycare while ensuring that no one wandered off or into danger. Mental endurance was equally critical. Stone Age children were unpredictable, emotionally volatile, and often unaware of the threats in their environment. Babysitters needed to anticipate tantrums, prevent dangerous mischief, and manage fear or crying, all while keeping their own stress under control. It was a high-stakes juggling act where every distraction could have deadly consequences. They had to be problem solvers, crisis managers, and constant entertainers, turning mundane activities into engaging experiences that kept the little ones occupied and safe. Humor, clever distraction, and quick thinking were vital survival tools. Childcare also had a surprisingly strategic role in the tribe's continuity. Every child who survived infancy represented the future of the tribe. Its hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, firekeepers, and yes, even sanitation workers. Babysitters were literally safeguarding the tribe's next generation, ensuring that knowledge, skills, and traditions could be passed on. This meant that the job, while exhausting and thankless, was foundational to the survival of the community. Without vigilant caregivers, the mortality rate for infants and young children would have skyrocketed, jeopardizing the tribe's long-term stability. Interestingly, Stone Age babysitters had to integrate childcare into other tasks seamlessly. Feeding, bathing, and soothing children often coincided with gathering food, monitoring the fire, or teaching survival skills. Multitasking was the name of the game, and failure to balance responsibilities could result in disaster. Imagine trying to explain the dangers of mammoth hunting while simultaneously calming a screaming infant and fending off curious toddlers reaching for sharp rocks. Babysitters became masters of improvisation, crisis management, and creative engagement. There was also a social dynamic to consider. Babysitters often acted as informal educators, teaching children basic survival skills, social rules, and observational learning. From demonstrating how to recognize edible plants to modeling fire safety, they imparted knowledge that would be critical in the coming years. Their role extended beyond mere supervision. They shaped behaviors, instilled caution, and prepared the next generation to handle the rigors of Stone Age life. Humor and storytelling were likely essential tools in this process. Singing, mimicking animals, or inventing games to keep children entertained while simultaneously educating them. The job came with high stakes, immense responsibility, and minimal recognition. Unlike hunters or toolmakers, babysitters rarely received praise unless something went wrong. They were constantly visible yet invisible, their efforts taken for granted until disaster struck, and yet the role carried unique rewards. Seeing a child survive a season, mastering a new skill, or successfully navigating a crisis provided a quiet satisfaction. They had no bosses, no deadlines, and no formal titles, but they were the lifeblood of the tribe's future. In conclusion, Stone Age babysitters were unsung heroes of survival. They juggled multiple responsibilities, endured extreme physical and mental strain, and safeguarded the next generation against countless threats. Their work required vigilance, ingenuity, patience, and an extraordinary tolerance for chaos. Humor, storytelling, and creativity likely kept them sane while managing screaming, biting, and mischievous little humans. Without these tireless caregivers, the continuity of early human society would have been in serious jeopardy. They may not have had official recognition, but their contribution to the survival, growth, and future of the tribe was immeasurable, a fact that modern parents and childcare workers can definitely appreciate. Every history book celebrates hunters, firekeepers, and cave painters, but what about the countless other roles that kept Stone Age society functioning? These were the unsung heroes, the workers who rarely earned glory, but whose labor was essential to survival. They carried heavy loads, guarded territory, patched shelters, and performed countless small but critical tasks. The good news, you have a job. The bad news, you still die young. Let's start with the heavy lifters. Every settlement, whether it was a cave, lean-to, or rudimentary hut, required materials to be transported: logs, stones, animal hides, and food. This wasn't a casual stroll, it was back-breaking work. Imagine hauling a slab of mammoth meat several miles over uneven terrain, balancing it on your back while keeping an eye out for predators, and hoping the path doesn't collapse into a stream. These laborers were the Stone Age equivalent of construction crews, delivery drivers, and movers, all rolled into one sweaty, mud-covered person. Their work was grueling, repetitive, and physically punishing, but without them the tribe would have had neither shelters nor sufficient food storage. Then there were the guards. Territory had to be protected from rival tribes, predatory animals, and the occasional marauding mammoth, or worse, a particularly irritable saber-toothed cat. Stone Age security wasn't about fences or locks. It was about vigilance, stamina, and a sharp eye. Guards patrolled day and night, often with nothing but sticks, spears, and the occasional loud yell to keep dangers at bay. The role demanded constant awareness, courage, and quick reflexes. One moment of inattention could lead to a raid, an attack, or a tragic encounter with nature's fury. And yet, despite the high stakes, these guardians rarely received recognition unless disaster struck. A thankless job that modern security personnel can probably empathize with. Shelter maintenance was another critical yet overlooked task. Early humans didn't have brick-and-mortar homes or weatherproof roofs. They had structures built from wood, animal hides, mud, and bone, all of which required constant repair. Leaks, broken supports, and damaged coverings weren't minor inconveniences. They were life-threatening problems in freezing or rainy conditions. Those responsible for maintenance spent hours patching, propping, and reinforcing shelters, ensuring the tribe had a dry, safe place to sleep. It was tedious, dirty, and occasionally dangerous, yet absolutely essential to survival. Food preparation beyond hunting and gathering was another miscellaneous responsibility. Someone had to clean, cut, and store meat, soak grains or roots, and preserve leftovers to prevent spoilage. This involved long hours, repetitive motions, and the constant risk of contamination, all while balancing the demands of cooking with other survival tasks. It was a complex logistical dance requiring both skill and endurance, often performed without any of the recognition given to hunters or celebrated food gatherers. The Stone Age also required miscellaneous artisans, people who fixed tools, repaired clothing, or made simple furniture and storage containers. These craftspeople were indispensable, even if history forgot their names. A broken spear, a torn hide, or a collapsed storage pit could spell disaster for the tribe. Their labor was continuous, meticulous, and physically taxing, but it kept the tribe functional and capable of surviving harsh environments. Then there were the general helpers, individuals who carried messages between groups, scouted new areas, or assisted with communal projects. Their work might seem minor compared to the drama of hunting a mammoth or painting a cave mural, but these roles maintained order, ensured communication, and kept the tribal ecosystem running smoothly. Without them, coordination would fail, chaos would ensue, and survival chances would plummet. Despite the lack of recognition, these miscellaneous jobs shaped the daily life and resilience of Stone Age communities. They required a combination of physical strength, intelligence, attention to detail, and flexibility. Workers had to adapt to changing conditions, troubleshoot unexpected problems, and collaborate effectively with others. Humor, camaraderie, and shared hardship likely helped mitigate the relentless toil, joking about collapsing shelters, slippery river crossings, or spilled loads probably served as an essential mental release in a life otherwise dominated by survival. The beauty of these invisible jobs lies in their universality. While specific roles like hunters or firekeepers were highly specialized, miscellaneous labor allowed every able-bodied individual to contribute to the tribe's survival. These were the people who plugged the gaps, kept the wheels turning, and ensured that the more glamorous tasks could be performed safely and effectively. In essence, they were the backbone of early human society, the cogs in the machine without which the entire operation would grind to a halt. In conclusion, Stone Age work wasn't glamorous, safe, or particularly rewarding, but it was essential. While history celebrates the hunters, toolmakers, and firekeepers, we mustn't forget the countless other roles that kept humanity alive, carrying heavy loads, guarding territory, repairing shelters, and performing endless small but critical tasks were jobs that demanded strength, skill, and perseverance. They were grueling, thankless, and often dangerous, but without them, the tribe would have perished long before they could invent spears, fire, or art. Stone Age work was brutal, unglamorous, and sometimes absurdly difficult, yet through it all, humans survived, and survive they did, paving the way for the rest of us to complain about office chairs, Monday mornings, and Wi-Fi outages instead. The Roman banquet. A spectacle that made your average modern dinner party look like a polite snack break with small talk about the weather. If you were a Roman elite, eating wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about demonstrating wealth, power, and the ability to handle an amount of food that would make even a competitive eater faint with envy. Picture this: a sprawling dining hall, mosaics underfoot, and couches lined up around a central table groaning under the weight of dozens of dishes. The good news? You get to eat like an emperor. The bad news? Your stomach didn't RSVP. Roman banquets were meticulously staged performances. Guests were not merely invited to eat, they were invited to perform, to demonstrate their sophistication, their tolerance for indulgence, and their ability to maintain a conversation while their stomachs were filing formal complaints. The event was as much about who you were as what you ate. Arriving late could be interpreted as social suicide, and arriving too early could make you look desperate, which, in Roman terms, was worse than showing up in unwashed sandals. The layout of a banquet was itself an art form. The main table, or triclinium, was typically arranged with 3 couches forming a U-shape, allowing guests to recline on their left sides while using the right hand for eating. Imagine trying to juggle multiple courses while awkwardly lying down, and you start to understand the level of commitment these people had to dining. It was all about maximizing comfort, or at least looking comfortable while your stomach silently screamed, "Abort mission." Now let's talk about the lavishness. Roman banquets could feature as many as 10 to 20 courses, often starting with light appetizers like olives, eggs, and small fish, moving on to heavier meats and exotic seafood, and finishing with desserts that ranged from honey-soaked pastries to fresh fruits imported from far-off provinces. Each course was more elaborate than the last, and the presentation was just as important as the taste. Dishes were often garnished with flowers, herbs, or even gold leaf if your social status demanded it. Basically, if your salad wasn't twinkling under torchlight, were you even eating in Rome? Exotic dishes weren't just for flavor, they were status symbols. The Romans had a well-documented taste for culinary shock value. Dormouse stuffed with minced meat, flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and even roasted parrots were considered delicacies among the elite. These dishes weren't merely for eating, they were conversation starters. Oh, you had a stuffed dormouse for dinner? How quaint. I personally went for the peacock, served with a side of virtue, of course. The point was clear: the more bizarre the dish, the higher your prestige. Your stomach might have disagreed, but social climbing is rarely painless. And let's not forget the wine, because no Roman banquet was complete without it. Wine flowed freely, often watered down for regular citizens and served stronger for the elite, and it was sometimes spiced with honey, herbs, or even seawater. Drinking was a serious business, and losing control or failing to toast appropriately could have social consequences. There were entire rituals around pouring, serving, and tasting wine. It wasn't just about getting tipsy. It was about demonstrating your capacity for moderation and your ability to keep sipping without spilling precious liquid on your tunic or your dignity. The funny, slightly terrifying part? Even if you were a seasoned diner, the sheer volume and extravagance of Roman banquets meant that stomach rebellion was inevitable. People who didn't plan for multiple courses often ended up reclining with a serene smile, while internally questioning every life choice that had led them to that moment. The Romans, ever inventive, often allowed for discreet vomiting, though we'll get into that deliciously absurd detail in later chapters. For now, imagine trying to maintain polite conversation with your left hand while your right hand subtly reaches for relief. The good news? You're participating in a centuries-old tradition. The bad news? So is your gastrointestinal tract. But beyond the food, beyond the wine, beyond the occasional worry about what you just ate, Roman banquets were cultural events. Poets and philosophers often attended, ready to declaim verses or debate ethics between courses. Musicians played lyres or flutes, adding a soundtrack to the feast. Sometimes even trained performers, dancers, acrobats, or exotic animals were part of the spectacle. This was not dinner. This was theatre with stomach cramps. It was a place where art, indulgence, and social climbing collided in a beautiful, chaotic mess of olive oil, gold leaf, and ambition. In short, a Roman banquet was the original extreme sport of dining. It tested your endurance, your composure, and your ability to look impressive while your body performed somersaults of disbelief. The good news? You're feasting like a patrician, reclining in a triclinium under torchlight, surrounded by exotic delicacies. The bad news? Your stomach is quietly drafting a resignation letter in Latin. By the end of the night, guests might leave with a sense of accomplishment, or at least the sense that surviving this epic display of human excess was worthy of a medal, a poem, or at the very least a long nap. And that, dear listener, is just the opening act of the mad, messy, and sometimes stomach-churning world of Roman banquets. If you thought overeating was just a modern problem involving buffet lines and holiday dinners, congratulations, you clearly haven't met a Roman elite. In ancient Rome, eating wasn't just a matter of survival or pleasure. It was an extreme sport, a social competition, and for some, a test of sheer human endurance. Welcome to the world of cena and commissatio, the main meal and drinking party that turned over indulgence into an art form. Think your family Thanksgiving is intense? Romans made it look like a polite snack break. Let's start with the cena, which was technically the main meal, but in reality was more like a marathon with courses. Unlike the modern three-course dinner, which often includes a salad and a dessert that's a glorified cookie, Roman dinners could stretch for hours, sometimes approaching an all-evening event. Guests reclined on couches, leaning on their left sides while their right hands performed delicate maneuvers of forkless eating. And yes, each course was intended to be bigger and more elaborate than the last, because nothing says I am socially superior like making your stomach scream in despair while everyone else pretends it's perfectly normal. But food was only half the challenge. Enter the commissatio, or drinking party. After or sometimes during the cena, Romans would shift to a celebration of wine, and not just a polite sip or two. This was full-blown, schedule-crushing, toast-after-toast merrymaking. The commissatio often involved elaborate rules: how to pour, when to toast, and how to judge the proper dilution of wine with water, because apparently, straight wine was for barbarians. Drinking was almost a performance art, and the ability to consume copious amounts of alcohol while remaining socially functional was a mark of true Roman sophistication. Competition was everywhere. Guests weren't just eating and drinking, they were participating in an unspoken tournament of indulgence. Who could eat the most dormice without gagging? Who could maintain the stiffest posture while reclining and downing copious amounts of honeyed wine? Who could survive the night without fainting, spilling food, or throwing up prematurely? The stakes were social, not just gastric. To refuse an extra plate or a second goblet was to signal weakness, and in a society obsessed with appearances, weakness was a crime punishable by ridicule. Romans also had inventive ways to keep the competition interesting. For example, some hosts would serve dishes in rapid succession, timing each course like a culinary gauntlet. Guests were expected to eat gracefully and keep conversation flowing while simultaneously calculating whether their stomachs would survive the next surprise dish. Imagine balancing a stuffed dormouse on your lap while debating philosophy and trying not to glance at the vomit bucket if you had one. It was like the ultimate multitasking exam, except with more wine and slightly worse consequences for failure. Humor, of course, was built right into the spectacle. Romans were remarkably self-aware about the absurdity of their indulgence. Some writers joked about the comical results of overeating guests so bloated they could barely recline, hosts frantically serving more food while realizing that no human stomach could possibly keep up, and servers darting around like caffeinated ants, desperately trying to keep up with the chaos. The dinner table wasn't just a place to eat. It was a theater where stomachs and egos collided in spectacular fashion. And here's an important nuance. Overeating wasn't purely for pleasure or status. It was also a form of social signaling. In a culture that revered excess, demonstrating the ability to eat vast quantities of exotic foods without complaint was a badge of honor. It said in effect, I am powerful, wealthy, and socially adept. I can handle whatever life or my host throws at me. Meanwhile, anyone who fainted, vomited early, or looked uncomfortable risked social embarrassment worse than sitting at the kiddie table today. Interestingly, this obsession with eating and drinking to excess had ritualistic and psychological dimensions too. Banquets provided an opportunity for elite Romans to reinforce bonds, negotiate alliances, and even show off intellectual prowess through clever conversation and poetic recitations. In other words, the stomach pain wasn't wasted, it came with a side of political leverage. Your ability to juggle meat, wine, and conversation demonstrated more than just gluttony. It demonstrated control, endurance, and cunning. The ultimate flex, if you will, with extra cheese or stuffed dormice. Finally, let's acknowledge the hilarity of it all. The average Roman banquet guest might leave after hours of eating, drinking, reclining, and competitive overindulgence with a mixture of pride and regret. Their bellies distended, their tongues sticky with honey, and their minds perhaps questioning some life choices. They had nonetheless performed their social duty. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a performance, a contest, and a subtle war of who could push human limits without collapsing into embarrassment. So next time you think your Thanksgiving, Christmas, or birthday feast is excessive, remember the Romans. They didn't just eat, they competed, they strategized, and they survived. Think of your family leftovers as a polite appetizer compared to the multi-hour extravaganza of cena and commissatio. And remember, while your stomach might grumble or rebel, at least it won't be judged in front of senators. When it comes to the Roman appetite for extravagance, the ordinary simply wouldn't do. By the time you'd survived the long courses of a cena and demonstrated your endurance in the commissatio, your stomach might have been filing complaints in Latin, but your social status demanded more. Enter the bizarre, the exotic, and occasionally the stomach-turning world of Roman delicacies. If Chapter 2 taught you how to eat too much, Chapter 3 introduces the terrifying question, what exactly were you eating? Let's start small, literally, the humble dormouse. Yes, the dormouse. Cute, tiny, and entirely edible if you happen to be a Roman elite. Stuffed dormouse were often roasted and seasoned with honey and spices, turning a tiny rodent into a culinary trophy. Romans didn't just eat them because they were tasty. They were a clear signal of refinement and wealth. After all, it takes dedication, skill, and a supplier willing to trap, raise, and prepare dormouse for dinner. It was a tiny creature with enormous social significance. Imagine your taste buds screaming while your social status quietly cheered. Moving up the food chain, we arrive at the flamingo. Yes, the flamingo. The bird you'd normally associate with ornamental ponds or awkwardly positioned lawn decor. Romans, however, saw it as a perfect source of culinary prestige. Flamingo tongues, in particular, were prized for their unique texture and flavor. They were a dish that said, I am powerful enough to eat a creature most people only sketch for fun, and yes, I paid someone to import it alive. Your guests might have gasped, your stomach might have groaned, but your status, impeccable. Eating flamingo tongues wasn't about nourishment, it was about performing wealth in the most literal sense possible. And then there's garum, the fermented fish sauce that could make or break a Roman meal. Imagine taking every small, smelly fish in the Mediterranean, letting it sit in the sun until it turned into a pungent, salty sludge, and then drizzling it over everything from meat to vegetables. To the modern nose, it sounds like a prank. To the Roman elite, it was liquid gold. Garum wasn't just a seasoning, it was a statement. I have taste, I have refinement, and I can tolerate smells that would make ordinary citizens faint. The aroma alone could clear a room, but the social signal it sent was undeniable. The common thread in all these dishes is that Roman dining wasn't about sustenance, it was about symbolism. Exotic foods were status symbols, carefully chosen to display wealth, sophistication, and daring. You didn't serve stuffed dormice to your family because they were cheap or easy. You served them because the ability to procure and prepare such a dish said more about your social standing than words ever could. Your guests weren't just tasting food, they were witnessing power, influence, and sometimes a terrifying lack of common sense. Some Romans even went further, creating dishes so elaborate they bordered on absurdity. Consider stuffed peacocks, complete with reassembled heads, feathers, and carefully arranged plumage, or dormice presented in miniature nests with delicate pastry twigs. The goal wasn't merely to satisfy hunger, it was to impress, shock, and entertain. Your stomach might have questioned your life choices, but your social credits skyrocketed. The more bizarre and difficult to procure the food, the higher the culinary prestige. There was also an element of intellectual performance involved. Roman hosts often expected guests to comment on textures, flavors, and aromas, offering poetic or philosophical insights, while carefully chewing stuffed dormice or sampling flamingo tongues. Eating wasn't passive, it was interactive theater. Imagine reciting a line of Virgil while discreetly hiding the urge to gag. Your eloquence, taste, and composure were all being evaluated alongside your ability to handle unfamiliar and occasionally alarming foods. Even dessert could be extravagant. Fruits imported from far-off provinces, candied nuts, and honey-soaked pastries were common, often displayed in ornate bowls or on gilded platters. Presentation was as crucial as taste. A beautifully arranged platter could elevate a meal from indulgence to artistry. The Romans understood that dining was a sensory experience encompassing taste, sight, and social perception. If it looked impressive and smelled powerful, it had done its job, even if your palate was silently filing complaints. It's worth noting that while these dishes might sound grotesque today, they were part of a deeply ingrained culture of culinary experimentation. Exotic foods weren't mere curiosities, they were essential tools for networking, alliance building, and social differentiation. In a world where wealth and influence were everything, knowing how to handle an unfamiliar delicacy could mean the difference between political advancement and social humiliation. So, the next time you complain about that weird sushi roll or the odd ingredient in a gourmet dish, remember the Romans. They weren't just eating, they were performing, competing, and defining social hierarchies bite by bite. Your taste buds may scream, your stomach may mutiny, but your status, impeccable. In short, the Roman obsession with exotic foods was a spectacle, a status statement, and a test of human tolerance all rolled into one. Dormice, flamingos, and fermented fish sauce were more than food. They were social armor, conversation starters, and sometimes small acts of daring. The vomitorium. The word that makes modern readers picture a room full of reclining nobles politely leaning over buckets while politely hurling their dinner into submission. Before we let our imagination run wild, let's clear up a long-standing misconception. The vomitorium was not actually a room designed for vomiting. It was, in fact, an architectural feature, a passageway in a theater or stadium designed to allow crowds to enter and exit efficiently. Yes, the Romans were brilliant engineers, but they did not build entire rooms just to encourage barfing in style. The rumor likely spread because, well, Roman banquets already had enough bodily chaos to make it believable. That said, despite the architectural truth, there's no denying that Romans sometimes engaged in deliberate vomiting during feasts. Before you recoil, understand this. Banquets were social marathons. After several courses of exotic meats, honeyed pastries, and wine so potent it could double as a cleaning solvent, some diners found themselves in a bit of a logistical jam, stomachs full, plates still arriving, and pride on the line. The solution? Strategic regurgitation. Yes, the elite would sometimes excuse themselves from the table to clear space for the next round. Room service had a very different meaning back then. The practice, surprisingly, wasn't considered disgraceful among those who could afford the luxury. In fact, it was almost a mark of sophistication. The idea was simple. A true connoisseur didn't merely survive a banquet, they conquered it. To finish a lavish meal gracefully while retaining the ability to continue eating and conversing was considered a feat of endurance, strategy, and human ingenuity. In essence, vomiting was less about desperation and more about logistics, a calculated move in the larger game of social dining. Historical sources suggest that this was not an everyday activity. It was limited to the wealthiest, who had both the means and the inclination to push their bodies to extremes. The average Roman citizen didn't have multiple exotic courses delivered to their homes or palaces. They had simpler fare and far fewer reasons to rehearse their stomach's flexibility. For the elites, however, the banquet was a display of power, endurance, and, yes, digestive dexterity. It was a chance to show that no dish was too exotic, no wine too strong, and no stomach too small to navigate the complexities of haute Roman dining. Interestingly, the practice also reflected the Romans' pragmatic approach to excess. Whereas modern sensibilities might consider vomiting at the table disgusting, Romans framed it as a method of extending the experience of indulgence. If you think about it, the logic makes a strange sort of sense. Why stop the feast when you could create space for more courses and more opportunities to impress your peers? It's like hitting the reset button on your digestive system, an extreme, slightly horrifying but undeniably efficient form of multitasking. Humor aside, there were social rules and etiquette around the practice. No one wanted a chaotic spectacle with guests emptying their guts in the middle of the room, so discretion was key. Guests would politely excuse themselves, sometimes using specially positioned vessels if needed, and return to the table refreshed for the next course. The act, when performed correctly, allowed the dinner to continue smoothly, maintaining both the social harmony and the visual spectacle of abundance that defined Roman feasts. Think of it as a secret backstage trick in a theatrical performance. Only the actors' stomachs were involved. The misinterpretation of the vomitorium also underscores a broader point about Roman dining culture. Appearances were everything. The elite went to extraordinary lengths to demonstrate sophistication, from elaborate multi-course meals to strategic vomiting. Every action, whether eating, drinking, or discreetly clearing stomach space, was part of a carefully choreographed social dance. Your ability to maintain composure and grace, even while performing an act that modern audiences would find horrifying, was an integral part of your social evaluation. There's also a darkly comedic side to consider. Imagine arriving at a banquet, reclining elegantly, sampling stuffed dormice, sipping honeyed wine, and then glancing politely at a fellow guest who excuses themselves to make room. You nod, smiling, all the while wondering if you too will need to follow the ritual, or if your stomach, having politely RSVP'd, might stage a rebellion anyway. It was elegance and grotesque practicality rolled into one, a high-wire act where the only net was sheer social cunning. In summary, the vomitorium myth is entertaining, yes, but it masks the fascinating reality of Roman banquets. While the term originally referred to a clever architectural solution, it coincidentally dovetailed with the Romans' occasional practice of vomiting for practical purposes. The act wasn't merely indulgence, it was a calculated strategy, an expression of endurance, and a way to extend the spectacle of excess. Room service had never been so ambitious. By understanding the misunderstood vomitorium, we see Roman dining culture in all its glory, extreme, absurd, clever, and occasionally a little terrifying. The next chapters will explore the reasons behind this gluttony, the drinking culture that fueled it, and the social politics of eating that made every meal a test of wit, willpower, and intestinal fortitude. By now, we've established that Roman banquets were long, lavish, and occasionally involved strategic expulsion of consumed food. But why exactly did these elite diners deliberately empty their stomachs? Was it sheer gluttony, a strange social ritual, or some proto-scientific understanding of digestion? The truth is a mix of all three, and like much of Roman life, it was performed with equal parts strategy, indulgence, and bravado. One of the primary reasons was practical, making room for more food. Roman banquets were not three-course affairs, they were multi-hour marathons of indulgence. Guests were expected to sample dozens of dishes, often presented in rapid succession. Imagine attempting to navigate 10 courses of honey-glazed dormice, flamingo tongues, and roasted peacock while also tasting wine that could double as a disinfectant. At some point, even the most disciplined diner's stomach would signal enough. Strategic vomiting offered a solution: create space for the next indulgent course, maintain composure, and continue to impress your peers. It wasn't exactly a wellness trend, but your stomach would beg to differ. There was also a social dimension. Banquets were as much about displaying restraint, or at least the appearance of it, as they were about indulgence. The ability to consume extreme quantities of food while maintaining dignity and then excusing oneself briefly to prepare for the next round demonstrated both courage and social savvy. In a culture obsessed with appearances, the act of vomiting could be framed as a calculated maneuver rather than a sign of weakness. If performed correctly, it broadcast, "I can endure more than you, and I am sophisticated enough to do so gracefully." Think of it as a power move disguised as digestive necessity. Ritualistic and ceremonial aspects also played a role. Romans were, at their core, theatrical people, and dining was no exception. Overeating, drinking excessively, and occasionally emptying one's stomach could be framed as part of the spectacle, almost like a performance art embedded within the meal. The act of making space for more food could become a ritualized part of the evening, a signal to others that the banquet was not just a meal, it was an event, a contest, and a display of human fortitude. Guests were not merely eating, they were participating in an ongoing drama of indulgence, endurance, and sometimes absurdity. Interestingly, there were even philosophical and medical justifications offered by some Roman thinkers. Certain physicians argued that purging after a meal could aid digestion or prevent discomfort, though we now know this was more superstition than science. Nonetheless, it added a veneer of legitimacy to what would otherwise be considered extreme behavior. In other words, if someone questioned why you had to excuse yourself mid-course, You could confidently explain it as health-conscious, a convenient way to justify extreme gluttony without losing face. The connection to Roman obsession with indulgence and excess cannot be overstated. Romans viewed life as a spectacle, and the elite had both the means and the social obligation to live dramatically. Eating wasn't a mundane activity. It was a chance to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and the ability to navigate a world of abundance. Vomiting strategically, whether for practical, social, or ceremonial reasons, became an extension of this culture. It was indulgence refined into an art form, a way to push the boundaries of human consumption while still maintaining the appearance of control. Humor was ever present in this extreme dining culture. Imagine a guest reclining elegantly on a couch, sampling flamingo tongues, sipping honeyed wine, and casually excusing themselves with the air of someone about to attend a poetry recital. Meanwhile, their stomach is quietly muttering complaints in Latin that no one else can hear. The good news? You're performing at the height of sophistication. The bad news? Your internal organs might stage a rebellion. It was simultaneously heroic, grotesque, and undeniably entertaining, at least from a historical perspective. There's also a subtle psychological dimension, the thrill of transgression. Deliberate vomiting at a banquet was not just tolerated, it could be admired when executed with style. It allowed diners to push social and physical boundaries in a controlled environment. The act demonstrated confidence, bravery, and a willingness to indulge fully in the excesses that defined elite Roman culture. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and status, showing you could handle extreme abundance even if it meant temporarily emptying your stomach was a potent display of power. Finally, it's important to recognize that these behaviors were entirely contextual. Outside the elite banquet, Romans did not practice this kind of excess. It was a cultivated performance, a product of wealth, social expectation, and the desire to demonstrate mastery over both body and etiquette. The elite's ability to consume, regurgitate, and continue dining gracefully became a symbol of status, endurance, and daring, all rolled into a single bizarre tradition. In summary, the reasons Romans purged during banquets were a cocktail of practicality, social strategy, ritualistic performance, and a hint of proto-medical advice. Gluttony alone does not explain it. It was indulgence elevated to a theatrical, competitive, and social art form. Your taste buds may have screamed, your stomach may have rebelled, and modern sensibilities may shudder. But for Romans, it was just another way to navigate the spectacle of excess that was elite dining. The good news? You can marvel at their ingenuity from a safe distance. The bad news? Your stomach did not get the invitation. If overeating was the sport, drinking at Roman banquets was the endurance marathon, and sometimes the full-blown obstacle course. Wine wasn't a casual accompaniment. It was the lifeblood of social interaction, the lubricant for conversation, and often the secret ingredient in turning a polite dinner into a raucous spectacle. The good news? You're having fun. The bad news? So is the flaw with your dinner. Romans approached wine with a combination of reverence, ritual, and competitive spirit. Unlike modern casual sipping, wine at a banquet was a highly orchestrated affair. Hosts often provided both pure wine and watered-down versions, depending on social rank, tolerance, and the desired pace of intoxication. Watering wine wasn't just about moderation, it was a form of social control. Too strong, and guests might embarrass themselves. Too weak, and the evening could drag. The correct balance was crucial, and misjudging it could lead to chaos or comedic catastrophe. Wine wasn't drunk in isolation. It accompanied every course, often flowing freely while diners reclined on their couches, juggling plates, conversation, and occasionally attempts to maintain dignity. Toasting was an essential part of the evening, with multiple rounds expected at various points in the meal. Guests needed to praise the host, compliment the dishes, and demonstrate their eloquence, all while keeping the wine from spilling and their stomachs from rebelling. It was a delicate dance of coordination, intellect, and liquid courage. This combination of alcohol and overeating created a unique kind of banquet chaos. Imagine dozens of guests reclining shoulder to shoulder, consuming exotic dishes, and alternating between serious conversation and drunken antics. Some might grow loquacious, launching into philosophical debates with more passion than sense. Others might attempt feats of elegant eating, maneuvering entire dormice across plates while negotiating their way through the crowd. The room buzzed with energy, laughter, and occasionally the sound of something hitting the floor. It was a calculated chaos designed to impress, entertain, and test the limits of human consumption. Humor, of course, was inherent in the process. Romans were remarkably self-aware about the absurdity of their indulgence. Writers from the era recorded tales of guests who had consumed so much wine that their conversation devolved into slurred poetry recitations or impromptu philosophical treatises. Others became unexpectedly bold, complimenting the host with exaggerated gestures, attempting to sample every dish, or reclining so dramatically that their arms threatened neighboring plates. The result was a mix of admiration, amusement, and occasional horror, depending on where you were sitting in the room. There was also a subtle element of competition involved. Guests often measured themselves against one another. Who could consume the most wine while remaining coherent? Who could sip continuously while sampling every exotic dish without collapsing? The act of drinking was both literal and symbolic, a demonstration of stamina, refinement, and the ability to navigate social expectations under the influence. Some diners even treated it as a test of endurance, seeing how long they could maintain poise while their senses were dulled and their stomachs stretched to the limit. The combination of food and alcohol could also turn the banquet into theatrical chaos. Servers darted among the couches, refilling goblets, arranging dishes, and trying to keep the spectacle from spiraling completely out of control. Guests laughed, argued, gestured wildly, and occasionally spilled food or drink onto the floor. Despite the mess, or perhaps because of it, the atmosphere was electric. Every gesture, every toast, every accidental slip was part of the performance, a living tableau of indulgence and revelry. The good news? You're enjoying the evening. The bad news? So is your dinner, now decorating the floor like an abstract artwork of culinary excess. Drunken revelry wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Elite Romans saw intoxication as an opportunity to display personality, charm, and wit. Those who could maintain eloquence while tipsy gained admiration. Those who lost control, well, they became part of the evening's entertainment. In a society obsessed with appearances and social hierarchy, knowing how to balance merriment with dignity was a prized skill. Wine, after all, was a social lubricant, a test of endurance, and occasionally a catalyst for unforgettable and slightly terrifying memories. It's also worth noting that the ritualized nature of drinking reinforced bonds among guests. Shared intoxication created camaraderie, broke down social barriers, and provided a common ground for conversation, jest, and the occasional philosophical debate. It was both bonding and a subtle competition, a test of how well you could navigate the extremes of indulgence while still maintaining social grace. By the end of the night, the combination of multi-course gluttony and relentless wine consumption produced a mix of elation, exhaustion, and occasionally regret. Guests had navigated a gauntlet of exotic foods, social expectations, and intoxicating beverages, often leaving with a sense of accomplishment, or at least the knowledge that they had survived the spectacle. The good news, you were part of the action, reclining elegantly and enjoying the performance. The bad news, your floor had enjoyed it too, and probably in a way your shoes would never forgive. In short, wine at Roman banquets was more than a drink. It was a social weapon, a test of endurance, and a key ingredient in the spectacle of indulgence. Drinking, combined with the extreme feasting we've explored in previous chapters, turned every dinner into a chaotic theatrical event, a carefully choreographed display of power, stamina, and occasionally comedy. The Romans knew how to party, just don't look too closely at the floor. By the time a Roman elite sat down for a banquet, the food on the table was only half the story. The other half, a subtle, unspoken, and sometimes absurd contest of social dominance. Banquets were less about nourishment and more about showing wealth, power, and sophistication, and sometimes doing it in a way that left your neighbors either awestruck or quietly panicking. Your neighbor just served a roasted peacock. What are you going to do? Serve a dragon? Not quite, but in Roman terms it might as well have been. Roman elites used banquets as a display of prestige. The arrangement of courses, the rarity of the ingredients, the skill of the cooks, and even the decorative touches on platters were all carefully curated signals. I am rich, I am powerful, and I have the connections to make this happen. Exotic meats, imported spices, and delicate pastries weren't just for flavor, they were statements. If a dinner guest saw a dish that required a small army of cooks or a fleet of traders to procure, the message was clear. This host is not merely wealthy, they are socially untouchable. Competition between elite families was common. Banquets could become subtle contests of extravagance, each host attempting to outdo the last. Records survive of families who reportedly staged feasts to surpass one another in the number of courses, the rarity of ingredients, or the sheer spectacle of the event. One family might feature stuffed dormice and flamingo tongues. Another might respond with imported peacock, pastries gilded in gold, and wine so rare it could have been sold by weight. The implicit question was always the same. Who could display the greatest combination of resources, taste, and composure? Humor played a role here too. Imagine the mental gymnastics required to stay polite while your neighbor unveils a platter of peacock and you realize your best offering is a roasted boar. It wasn't merely a culinary disappointment, it was a social challenge. Guests might whisper, joke, or quietly assess the balance of power in the room. Every dish, every goblet of wine, every careful display of culinary skill contributed to an ongoing drama of social maneuvering, sometimes with as much tension as a political debate. Banquets also reinforced hierarchy and social networking. Seating arrangements were crucial. Those closest to the host signaled favor, while those relegated to the edges of the triclinium signaled lesser importance. Even the order in which guests were served could carry meaning. High-ranking guests might receive the first taste of a rare delicacy, while others watched, silently noting the subtleties of preference and influence. In this way, banquets were not simply dinners, they were arenas for demonstrating social intelligence, political awareness, and subtlety in navigating relationships. The competitive aspect extended to presentation and theatrics as well. Hosts often employed servers who moved in synchronized patterns, presenting dishes with fanfare and precision. Exotic animals might appear as part of the display. Acrobats could perform, and musicians might provide a soundtrack for the evening. It was a full sensory experience designed to impress, and if done correctly, leave guests both awed and slightly intimidated. Dining had become theater, with wealth and power as the stars of the show. Humor and absurdity were woven into these spectacles. For example, the very idea that one could outdo a neighbor in a display of food is both ridiculous and telling of the social priorities of the era. A single dish could become a status symbol, a conversation starter, and a test of whether the host had what it took to maintain dominance in elite society. Your stomach might have been silently protesting the 10th course of exotic meats, but your social standing was soaring, at least in theory. There were even stories of banquets escalating into near-mythical contests of extravagance. Some families reportedly tried to outshine rivals by serving rare birds, multiple exotic dishes per course, or intricate desserts that took days to prepare. While modern historians debate the accuracy of these tales, they illustrate the Roman appetite for ostentation. Food was no longer merely sustenance, it was a weapon in the subtle warfare of prestige and influence. Ultimately, Roman banquets exemplified the intersection of indulgence, spectacle, and strategy. Each meal was a carefully orchestrated performance, a contest of culinary and social prowess designed to impress, intimidate, and assert dominance. While the dishes, wine, and sometimes vomitoriums were central to the experience, the underlying purpose was always about status. Who could eat the most, endure the most, and impress the most, all while appearing graceful and composed? The answer determined more than reputation. It subtly influenced alliances, friendships, and social mobility within elite circles. In summary, banquets were about much more than food. They were stages upon which wealth, power, and sophistication were displayed, tested, and occasionally exaggerated to absurd levels. From roasted peacocks to golden pastries, every element was chosen to impress and intimidate. Humor, competition, and spectacle all coexisted, creating events that were simultaneously social exercises, theatrical performances, and culinary adventures. For the Roman elite, a successful banquet was measured not just by how full one's stomach was, but by how elevated one's social standing had become by the end of the evening. As we reach the end of our journey through the extravagant, chaotic, and occasionally stomach-turning world of Roman banquets, it's time to reflect on the bigger picture. What did all this gluttony leave behind, and how did it influence dining habits for centuries to come? The Romans may have reclined on couches, feasted on flamingo tongues, and occasionally excused themselves to strategically purge, but their obsession with indulgence left a surprisingly lasting imprint on human culture. Roman feasts were, in many ways, a template for later European dining traditions. Medieval banquets borrowed the multi-course spectacle, complete with elaborate table settings, roasts designed to impress, and entertainment woven into the meal. Renaissance aristocrats, inspired by Roman excess, elevated dinner to a theatrical affair. They incorporated music, pageantry, and exotic ingredients imported from far-off lands. While dormice and flamingo tongues fell out of fashion, the philosophy remained. Eating wasn't just about sustenance, it was about displaying wealth, taste, and social savvy. The legacy extends even further. Modern fine dining, with tasting menus, multiple courses, and theatrical presentation, owes a subtle nod to Roman tradition. Consider a chef plating a tiny morsel with painstaking detail, or a sommelier orchestrating the perfect wine pairing. These practices echo the Roman emphasis on display, ritual, and sensory experience. The Romans taught us that eating could be performance art, and that indulgence, when wrapped in style and ceremony, could communicate far more than words ever could. Of course, Roman dining also serves as a cautionary tale about human nature. The drive to impress, to compete, and to indulge beyond necessity is timeless. Today, we may not recline on couches while consuming honeyed dormice, but many of us recognize the compulsion to keep up with trends, showcase status, or simply eat more than our stomachs can comfortably handle. Whether it's second helpings at Thanksgiving, Instagram-worthy desserts, or food challenges on social media, the echoes of Roman extravagance are everywhere. The absurdity remains, just with more cheese and fewer flamingo tongues. The humor in Roman gluttony also carries a lesson about social pressure and shared indulgence. Romans weren't overeating purely out of appetite. They were performing for each other, proving endurance, taste, and social intelligence. Similarly, modern humans often eat not just to nourish themselves, but to participate in social rituals, meet expectations, or demonstrate cultural literacy. Yes, I've tried the truffle oil. No, I won't judge your pizza preference. The mechanisms have changed, but the psychology is remarkably familiar. Gluttony is often less about hunger and more about connection, competition, and a hint of prideful absurdity. Roman culture also reminds us that indulgence is sometimes celebrated precisely because it's extreme. The more exotic, the more difficult to procure, and the more outrageous the dish, the greater its social significance. Dormice, flamingo tongues, and gilded pastries weren't just food, they were statements. In modern terms, this might be the equivalent of buying the most expensive bottle of wine for a dinner party, or preparing a dessert that looks like a miniature work of art. The principle is the same. Eating can be a stage, and those who master it gracefully earn admiration, attention, and sometimes envy. Interestingly, the Romans also left a subtler legacy in humor. Writers, satirists, and philosophers documented their excesses with a mix of awe and mockery, showing that even contemporaries could recognize the ridiculous side of indulgence. From the vomiting strategies to competitive feasting, humor was embedded in the ritual itself. Modern humans continue this tradition whenever we joke about overeating, cringe at food photos, or shake our heads at absurd culinary trends. Humor becomes a coping mechanism, a way to reconcile our enjoyment of food with the recognition of its sometimes preposterous social and cultural trappings. So, what can we take from the world of Roman gluttony? First, indulge wisely, but understand the spectacle behind indulgence. Second, remember that social performance has always influenced how and what we eat. Third, embrace a little absurdity. It's part of human nature, from ancient Rome to your local pizza joint. And finally, recognize that even in the most extreme forms of excess, there's a strange kind of elegance, a ritualized chaos that continues to shape our relationship with food, community, and status. In conclusion, Roman feasts remind us that eating has always been about more than nutrition. It's about performance, competition, indulgence, humor, and occasionally bodily revolt. The good news, you're not eating a stuffed dormouse tonight. The bad news, you still might regret that second slice of pizza. Congratulations, you were born noble in feudal Japan. Your family lineage stretches back generations, inked in scrolls, praised in poems, and occasionally immortalized in overly dramatic kabuki plays. You are, by right of birth, a samurai. This is a title that comes with honor, prestige, and the subtle expectation that your first toy might very well be a tiny practice sword capable of slicing your sibling's finger, or at least leaving a memorable bruise. Welcome to life as a samurai child, where every day is both a privilege and a test of endurance, patience, and occasional minor bleeding. From the moment you toddle into the world, you are steeped in social hierarchy. Your family's standing dictates how you play, how you learn, and even how you cry. Unlike commoners, whose childhoods might involve unstructured play, your first lessons involve observing etiquette, bowing correctly, and understanding who holds the power in every room. Even your diaper changes are probably witnessed by a stern aunt who murmurs, "One day this child will represent the family honor, don't soil it." Pressure? Maybe. But in the samurai universe, pressure is just another form of training. The early training culture for young samurai is intense. This is not the era of casual soccer practice or summer camp arts and crafts. Instead, your daily routine is a carefully orchestrated balance of play, study, and martial instruction, starting as early as age 5 or 6. Play often involves padded sticks, wooden swords, or occasionally real wooden poles that your parents assure you are just as sharp as they need to be. The goal is to instill dexterity, agility, and a healthy respect for the sharp edges of the world. Falling off a horse, tripping over a garden stone, or accidentally smacking a sibling with a practice katana are all considered character-building experiences. Your tears are not wasted, they are formative, and occasionally entertaining. Being born into the samurai class means understanding honor from the cradle. You're not merely a child, you are the future upholder of family prestige, the embodiment of your ancestors' achievements. Even small missteps are observed closely. Drop a cup, you're learning humility. Forget a proper bow, your reputation may falter. Laugh too loudly in front of elders, you are practicing emotional regulation under duress. Each moment, from breakfast to bedtime, is a micro-lesson in the art of appearing both composed and formidable, which is the ultimate samurai skill. Imagine being evaluated constantly while simultaneously learning to wield a stick that could theoretically pierce armor. That's childhood, samurai style. Your education begins early, but it is not limited to swordplay. Storytelling, history, poetry, and moral lessons are woven into your daily life, forming the intellectual and ethical backbone of your future warrior self. Parents and tutors recite tales of legendary samurai exploits, emphasizing courage, loyalty, and decisive action. But they also emphasize the subtler lessons: when to act, when to remain still, and when it is socially advantageous to nod politely while your rival trips over a garden rock. Observation is as important as action. By the age of 6, a samurai child might be able to recount 3 generations of ancestors' victories while simultaneously balancing a practice sword on their shoulder. And they do this with the seriousness of a tax auditor, auditing a rival clan's scrolls. Family expectations extend beyond the individual. Your performance reflects on your parents, siblings, and even distant cousins who may not have met you yet, but will certainly be judged by your ability to wield a wooden sword with dignity. This interconnected network of honor creates both motivation and mild terror. You learn early that your mistakes are never just personal. They ripple outward, potentially staining the reputation of everyone in your household. The pressure to succeed, combined with the absurdity of wielding tiny but deadly wooden swords, creates a childhood that is equal parts heroic training montage and darkly comedic farce. Humor, of course, is not absent. The samurai household, despite its formality, has moments of absurdity. Parents often lecture about honor while inadvertently placing sharpened practice weapons where toddlers might stumble. Siblings compete for parental approval, sometimes using minor physical aggression, which is gently excused under the guise of preparing for battle. Your first lesson in humility might involve being struck by a sibling's stick during a kata exercise, while an elder nods solemnly, murmuring, "Courage is forged in adversity." Your lesson? Life is unfair, weapons are sharp, and somehow all of this is noble. By the end of the day, being born into the samurai class is a paradoxical blend of privilege, peril, and rigorous expectation. You are both cherished and trained, loved and pushed to extremes, protected and exposed to calculated risks. From your first encounters with a practice sword to the subtle lessons in social observation, your childhood is a meticulously structured preparation for a life that demands honor, courage, and sometimes a little absurdity. And as you lay down to sleep, dreaming of your ancestors' glorious victories, you know one thing for certain. Your life will never be ordinary, and neither will your toys. The good news: you were born into prestige and power. The bad news: your first toy is a tiny sword that could ruin nap time and possibly a finger or two. But that, dear listener, is the noble chaos of being a samurai child. Welcome to the next stage of your samurai upbringing, early training. This is the part where childhood innocence gets politely kicked out the dojo door and replaced with routines that would make modern personal trainers weep. By the age of 6 or 7, you're no longer just a cute, noble child. You are a miniature warrior in the making, expected to endure daily drills that combine physical rigor, mental fortitude, and a healthy dose of mild terror. The samurai's day begins early, often before the sun rises, because apparently the universe does not wait for your comfort. Breakfast might consist of rice, pickled vegetables, and green tea. But don't be fooled. The true nourishment comes from knowing that in 20 minutes you will be running laps with a wooden sword strapped to your tiny shoulder. Physical training is the backbone of early samurai life, and it is relentless. Children practice martial arts moves repeatedly, learning the precise motions for strikes, blocks, and stances, sometimes while balancing on uneven surfaces. Why uneven surfaces? Because falling gracefully is just as important as striking accurately. Archery is another essential skill, and yes, you are expected to wield a bow taller than yourself. Imagine standing on a small stool, trying to pull a string taut enough to launch an arrow, all while maintaining a serene expression and perfect posture. If your arrow veers off target and lodges in a garden tree or worse, a family member's hat, you have failed not only your skill test, but also the sacred art of composure. Here, mental toughness is as critical as physical ability. A samurai child must internalize the paradox. Mistakes are inevitable, but one must appear unshakable while they happen. Cue the stoic frown and deep meditative breathing, even as your hands shake and your stomach growls. Horseback riding is no less absurd. Tiny riders are expected to manage full-sized horses, learning to balance, steer, and command with subtle movements. The learning curve is steep, and the consequences of error are often spectacular. A stumble could mean a face-first encounter with dirt, or worse, a strategic lesson in humility courtesy of an annoyed horse. Still, horsemanship is central to the samurai's identity, and early mastery demonstrates both courage and discipline. Humorously, many young samurai likely learned more about the temperament of horses than about their own siblings during these rides. Then comes the sword practice. At first it is simple wooden swords, safe in theory. In practice, these sticks are still capable of bruises, scratches, and minor eye emergencies. Children spar with one another under the watchful gaze of instructors, learning to anticipate movements, react instantly, and maintain composure under pressure. The drills are repetitive and grueling, but the purpose is clear. A samurai must be ready for sudden danger and must be able to respond without hesitation. The ability to endure boredom, fatigue, and occasional sibling sabotage is as important as any offensive technique. And yes, sometimes the exercises involve meditation in full armor immediately after a sprint, because why not add mental exhaustion to physical exhaustion? Speaking of meditation, let's pause for a moment. Young samurai are instructed to meditate, cultivate inner calm, and practice mindfulness. Here's the catch. You are meditating while carrying a sword taller than you and trying not to whine about the soreness in your back, shoulders, and tiny wrists. The mental exercise is brutal, designed to train focus, patience, and the ability to ignore very real discomfort. You learn early that a calm exterior is non-negotiable. It is part of your image, your status, and your survival toolkit. Discipline in the early years is not optional. Parents, tutors, and instructors monitor every movement, correcting posture, adjusting stances, and frequently reminding young samurai that whining is dishonorable. Mistakes are gently but firmly met with instruction, and occasionally with the sort of embarrassment that sticks with you for life. The goal is not cruelty, it's conditioning. The child must internalize resilience, self-control, and the understanding that success often demands persistence in the face of repeated failure. Humor finds its place in this rigorous routine, mostly in the small absurdities that punctuate otherwise serious training. Siblings trip over each other while performing drills, arrows veer wildly off target, meditation attempts collapse into giggles, and horses occasionally express disinterest in their riders' noble ambitions. The image of a small child, sword in hand, bowstring taut, riding a horse while trying to remain perfectly still and thoughtful, encapsulates the blend of dedication and comedic absurdity that defines early samurai life. By the end of each day, the young samurai is exhausted, sore, and sometimes bruised. Yet beneath the fatigue lies the foundation of future skill. Strength, coordination, focus, and resilience are all cultivated during these early years, forming the base upon which the adolescent and adult samurai will build. The daily repetition of drills, meditation, and discipline is a relentless teacher, embedding values of endurance, patience, and honor in every fiber of the child's being. The takeaways are simple. You must train rigorously, endure discomfort, and maintain composure at all costs. The good news? You're developing the skills to wield a sword like a true warrior. The bad news? Yes, you must meditate, but also carry a sword that's taller than you, and don't whine about it. Such is life in the early training of a samurai, grueling, absurd, and strangely formative. If early samurai training was about building muscles, reflexes, and the occasional sore thumb, the next stage of your upbringing is about shaping your moral compass, or, more accurately, forging it in a furnace of social pressure and ancestral expectations. This is the stage where the Bushido code enters your life like a stern teacher who never blinks. Bushido, the way of the warrior, is not merely a guideline, it is a complete life philosophy that governs thought, action, and even the choice of words while chewing your rice. Bushido emphasizes loyalty, honor, courage, and rectitude, and it is taken very seriously. Every action, from how you bow to your elders to how you treat your practice sword, has moral weight. Loyalty is paramount. You are expected to serve your family, your lord, and eventually your clan, placing their needs above your own. Even at a young age, the concept is drilled into you constantly. Refuse to fetch water for your tutor? That's not laziness, that's a moral failing. Lose a sparring match because you laughed at a friend's misstep? Dishonor. Forget to polish your wooden sword before morning drills? Catastrophic. The stakes are high, and the consequences are subtle but socially lethal. The concept of honor is central. A samurai child learns that reputation is everything. You are not just acting for yourself. You are representing your family, your ancestors, and even the social circle of your neighbors, who will inevitably gossip about your behavior. Dishonor your family once, and the local gossip network might as well write your obituary in calligraphy on a scroll. This kind of paranoia is intentional. It teaches vigilance, social awareness, and meticulous behavior. Even small missteps are magnified. Drop your practice bow, and you're not clumsy, you are careless. And careless warriors don't survive long in tales of valor. Courage, of course, is non-negotiable. This is not just battlefield bravery. It includes moral courage, the ability to speak and act rightly even when inconvenient or frightening. Standing up to a peer who mocks your calligraphy. Courage, accepting that your horse might throw you mid-ride. Courage, attempting a complicated sword kata without collapsing into the dirt. Courage. All these small acts accumulate, teaching that bravery is a habit, not just a heroic moment in battle. Humorously, for a 7-year-old, courage is often indistinguishable from sheer terror masked by stoic frowning and very shallow breathing. The Bushido code also demands rectitude and righteousness, which can feel like an ongoing moral obstacle course. Decisions, even trivial ones, are loaded with ethical implications. Should you step on a flower in your lord's garden to retrieve a wayward practice sword? Technically, yes, but morally, arguably no. Every action requires constant evaluation against the invisible scale of honor, duty, and societal expectation. Mistakes are not simply errors, they are lapses in virtue that can haunt your reputation for weeks, or at least until the next family dinner. Bushido's influence reaches far beyond mere action. It shapes thought and emotion. Even in moments of play, the young samurai is aware of moral standards. Laugh too loudly, argue too boldly, or eat dessert before dinner and you are not merely naughty, you are in theory corrupting your character. The line between discipline and paranoia blurs, teaching young warriors to constantly self-monitor. Humor becomes a coping mechanism. Imagine trying to enjoy a simple game of tag while simultaneously considering whether running past your sibling constitutes a moral failing. Welcome to a childhood full of stealthy ethics checks and existential second-guessing. Interestingly, Bushido also fosters strategic social thinking. Observing interactions, evaluating loyalty, and anticipating actions are just as critical as lifting a sword. A young samurai must learn not only to act but to perceive, to interpret subtle cues, and to understand the intentions of peers, teachers, and elders. This develops acute social intelligence, often masked as mild paranoia. You are perpetually scanning the room, balancing friendship, loyalty, and decorum, all while maintaining the serene exterior of a disciplined child. The humor in this intense moral environment often comes from the absurdity of hypervigilance. A child might agonize over whether it is dishonorable to pick the slightly bruised fruit, or if sneezing loudly in the dojo constitutes a moral lapse. Sibling rivalries are experienced as epic ethical dilemmas, and minor household mishaps become dramatic internal debates over virtue. The early years of living under Bushido create a curious blend of serious self-discipline and ridiculous, highly specific worry. By embedding these principles so thoroughly in childhood, the samurai code ensures that moral reasoning, courage, and loyalty are instinctive, not optional. Decisions are weighed against a lifelong expectation of honor, making obedience, attention, and ethical behavior second nature. This stage of training is less about physical skill and more about mental and emotional architecture, the scaffolding on which a competent, respected, and socially adept samurai is built. In conclusion, learning Bushido as a child is like receiving a lifelong instruction manual written in invisible ink, only readable under the constant light of scrutiny and self-awareness. Every action is weighted, every decision moralized, and every misstep amplified in the mind of a child being trained to be the ideal samurai. The good news: you are learning the secrets of courage, loyalty, and honor. The bad news: dishonor your family once, and the local gossip network might as well write your obituary, complete with exaggerated heroic feats you didn't actually perform. By now, the young samurai has learned the basics of discipline, honor, and mental fortitude. but no warrior is complete without the art of the sword. This is the stage where practice becomes serious and play transforms into a controlled chaos that hovers dangerously close to actual injury. Sword training for children in feudal Japan was a delicate balance, precise, disciplined, and occasionally hilarious in its unintended consequences. Training begins with the wooden sword or bokken. These sticks are deceptively heavy, often as long as the child is tall, and perfect for learning control, distance, and coordination. Early drills involve repetitive strikes, blocks, and stances, designed to ingrain muscle memory and refine reflexes. Teachers watched intently, correcting posture and hand placement, occasionally muttering that a child who could not properly hold a bokken had better start practicing or face a lifetime of dishonor. Meanwhile, the children's fingers, knuckles, and egos learned to endure repeated bumps and miscalculations. Dueling practice was both serious and absurd. Young samurai often sparred against one another under supervision, honing timing, strategy, and combat awareness. At first glance, these duels could appear chaotic. Small figures lunging and parrying, sometimes colliding spectacularly. But every movement was deliberate. Sparring taught children how to read an opponent, anticipate strikes, and react with speed and precision. The mental component was as critical as the physical. You could wield your sword perfectly, but if your mind wandered, even for a second, a minor misstep could leave you flat on the dojo floor. Danger was never far from the equation. Even with wooden swords, misjudged swings could result in bruises, bumps, or more theatrical near-death experiences. Teachers often incorporated elements of controlled risk to prepare children for real combat, believing that a slight scrape now would prevent disaster later, and so a child might find themselves ducking, rolling, or vaulting over a sparring partner with exaggerated urgency. The lesson? Adaptability and agility are as crucial as strength and skill, and sometimes the child discovered that humor was the best antidote to fear. Competitions added another layer of intensity and comedy. Young samurai frequently engaged in friendly contests to see who could land the most strikes or maintain balance while performing complex footwork. These contests cultivated skill, confidence, and a little rivalry among peers, but they also created unpredictable outcomes. One moment, a child might execute a flawless kata, their sword slicing the air with elegance. The next moment, their little brother could appear out of nowhere, tripping them with a wet kimono and turning the display of mastery into a spectacular tumble. The crowd, composed of teachers, elders, and occasionally siblings, would respond with a mixture of sighs, laughter, and gentle scolding. Advanced drills introduced dual-wielding exercises, footwork labyrinths, and precision strikes against moving targets. Children learned to coordinate both hands, maintain proper posture, and control the sword with finesse. Yet the exercises often highlighted the absurdity of childhood ambition. Picture a small child lunging with deadly intent while simultaneously trying not to step on a fellow trainee's foot, all in front of an audience of elder samurai ready to correct every minor misstep. The intensity was real, but the situation was often unintentionally comedic. Mental focus remained central. Young samurai were trained to maintain calm under pressure, to anticipate attacks, and to strategize multiple moves ahead. Drills were designed not just to improve technique, but to instill situational awareness, the ability to observe, predict, and respond in real time. This was especially important when sparring with siblings or peers, whose attacks were unpredictable, unrefined, and occasionally mischievous. Humor became a survival tactic. Laughing at a minor trip or a misfired strike helped children recover composure quickly and continue their training without losing confidence. Despite the intensity, the training incorporated moments of creativity and play. Teachers encouraged improvisation within drills, allowing children to experiment with footwork, grip, and angles of attack. Some schools even introduced mock battles with light padding or small practice arenas where young samurai could test their reflexes against multiple opponents. These exercises built agility, quick thinking, and teamwork, while occasionally devolving into chaotic but educational wrestling matches with swords, safely clashing off one another. By the end of this phase, Young samurai developed not only technical proficiency, but also an understanding of combat psychology, timing, patience, deception, and adaptability. They learned that mastery required more than strength, it demanded cleverness, creativity, and the ability to recover gracefully from failure. And they learned that humor and humility were essential. No matter how skilled you became, a sibling, a misstep, or a wet kimono could always humble you. In conclusion, sword mastery in childhood was a combination of discipline, physical endurance, and controlled chaos. It trained the body, sharpened the mind, and taught resilience in a safe but challenging environment. The good news: your sword skills are impressive. The bad news: your little brother can still trip you with a wet kimono, turning years of training into a spectacular humbling tumble, and somehow, that too is part of the lesson. If you thought the life of a young samurai was all wooden swords, bruises, and frantic duels, think again. By this stage it becomes clear: a samurai is not merely a walking katana with an attitude. They are also theoretically a scholar, a strategist, a poet, and occasionally a calligraphy enthusiast, whose work might impress even the most stoic of elders. The adage "brains over brawn" is subtly repurposed here. Your strength may defend your life, but your intellect protects your honor, and occasionally your lunch privileges. Education for young samurai extended far beyond swordplay, archery, or horseback riding. They were expected to master literature, history, poetry, and philosophy, all while maintaining the strict etiquette dictated by their social class. Reading and reciting classical texts was part of daily routine. Tales of legendary heroes, moral parables, and historical victories were not merely academic exercises. They were manuals for behavior, decision-making, and crucially, reputation management. By absorbing these lessons, children learned not only the deeds of their forebears, but also how to emulate them without tripping over their own feet. Calligraphy, often practiced with brush and ink, was another essential skill. Precision, patience, and elegance in writing were viewed as markers of sophistication and self-control. Mistakes in brushstrokes were more than minor errors. They reflected the character of the practitioner. A poorly executed kanji could be interpreted as laziness, carelessness, or even moral weakness, a terrifying prospect for a child already juggling swords, etiquette, and early philosophical contemplation. The lesson was clear: excellence is holistic, spanning mind, body, and brush. And yes, there was humor in these exercises, especially when a small child accidentally splattered ink across a tutor's robe, producing an abstract masterpiece that could, if interpreted generously, symbolize moral ambiguity. Strategy and military theory were integrated seamlessly into education. Young samurai studied classic texts on warfare, tactical formations, and the psychology of battle. Lessons were often hypothetical. If the enemy approaches from the east, which gate do you defend? Such exercises train children to think ahead, anticipate opponent moves, and devise multi-step solutions under pressure. While they might not be commanding legions at age 8, these mental drills developed analytical skills, situational awareness, and the subtle art of decision-making with consequences, even if those consequences were initially limited to losing a hypothetical war scenario or an embarrassing tutoring session. Etiquette, however, was arguably the trickiest part of education. Manners, gestures, and social conduct were not optional. They were essential to survival in elite circles. Bowing correctly, addressing elders with appropriate honorifics, handling tea ceremonies with exact precision, these were as critical as landing a strike in a duel. Failure to master etiquette could undermine years of physical training. Imagine memorizing every kata flawlessly, only to spill tea on a visiting noble's robe while demonstrating proper posture. A tragic yet humorously human reminder that a samurai's life is a delicate balance of art, discipline, and social acrobatics. Balancing the arts of the mind with the arts of war was unsurprisingly exhausting. Morning might involve rigorous physical drills, sparring, or archery practice. Afternoon sessions were spent poring over texts, writing poetry, or debating moral dilemmas. Evenings could include meditation, strategy games, or etiquette drills. Young samurai were essentially asked to be miniature Renaissance figures before the Renaissance existed, a combination of scholar, strategist, warrior, and socialite, all compressed into one tiny, slightly overworked body. Humor found its way naturally into these routines. Children, for example, might attempt to write haikus inspired by their archery practice, only to glance up at a fellow student's clumsy sparring and jokingly add a verse. Target missed again, wooden arrow kisses sky, my honor is gone. While technically inappropriate, such creative outlets offered relief from relentless discipline and built camaraderie among peers. Teachers tolerated minor irreverence, as long as it did not compromise the overall lessons of focus, poise, and respect. Moreover, the education emphasized adaptability. Samurai were expected to apply lessons from literature, history, and etiquette to real-world challenges. If a child learned a moral story about courage in battle, the real test might come during a sparring session, where strategy, composure, and quick thinking determined success. If calligraphy taught patience and precision, then those skills translated to wielding a sword with careful control. The mind and body were integrated in a seamless feedback loop, training the young samurai to approach life both on and off the battlefield with clarity, foresight, and ideally a sense of humor. By the end of this stage, a young samurai is no longer just a physically capable child. They are a budding intellectual, a disciplined student of culture, and a strategic thinker, all while retaining the mental resilience honed through years of drills and sparring. They have learned that being a warrior involves more than strength or bravery. It demands knowledge, grace, and the ability to navigate the absurdly complex rules of society. The good news? You are learning to write poetry, study history, and master etiquette. The bad news? Yes, memorize poetry. Yes, practice archery. No, you cannot write haikus on your opponent's armor. Life, dear listener, is delicate, precise, and occasionally hilarious, just like a true samurai. After years of grueling training, rigorous education, and a childhood filled with honor, discipline, and mild existential paranoia, the young samurai reaches a pivotal stage, adolescence. This is the moment when practice meets reality, and the dusty wooden swords of childhood are swapped eventually for steel, armor, and the adrenaline-soaked chaos of the battlefield. Welcome to the first taste of adulthood in combat, where the lessons learned in dojo, library, and tea ceremony suddenly collide with the unpredictable, often absurd reality of war. Teenage samurai were often thrust into their first real combat experience with a mixture of excitement, terror, and an almost comical attention to detail. Years of training were meant to prepare them physically and mentally, yet the battlefield had its own rules, many of which involved tripping hazards, mud, and occasionally very inconvenient weather. The transition was brutal. Young warriors discovered that while sword technique was crucial, situational awareness, quick thinking, and the ability to follow complex orders under pressure were even more important. Every movement mattered. Every decision could tip the balance between honor and humiliation. Social responsibilities expanded significantly at this stage. Young samurai were expected not only to fight, but also to uphold their family name, maintain loyalty to their lord, and participate in strategic planning sessions. Even before the battle began, there was a dizzying array of preparation rituals: armor inspection, sword sharpening, ceremonial bowing to commanders, and the unglamorous but critical act of making sure your sandals were properly tied. Forget this, and history books might remember you not for heroic valor, but for a spectacularly clumsy and painfully avoidable demise. Humorous as it seems now, tying sandals properly was literally a matter of life and death, a lesson no dojo could fully simulate. Preparation for the first battle was an ordeal of ritual, repetition, and carefully orchestrated absurdity. Armor weighed heavily, restricting movement while magnifying every misstep. Helmets limited vision, and layered clothing created a sensation akin to wrestling a slightly aggressive octopus. While these constraints were designed to protect the body, they also tested patience, balance, and adaptability. Training had instilled strength and stamina, but the unpredictable chaos of real combat quickly revealed where theory met comedy in the most inconvenient ways. The battlefield itself was a curious mixture of structured strategy and utter chaos. Samurai learned to follow tactical formations, relay commands, and coordinate with fellow warriors. Yet even in disciplined units, unexpected moments abounded. Horses veered off course, soldiers collided mid-charge, and arrows occasionally fell harmlessly or embarrassingly into muddy terrain. Observing these absurdities while maintaining composure was a lesson in itself. The ability to recognize humor in the chaos could prevent panic, encourage camaraderie, and sometimes even boost morale. First engagements also tested the psychological preparation of young samurai, the anticipation of facing real opponents, people who were also trained, armed, and motivated, was intense. For years, practice bouts had been controlled, predictable, and safe. Now adrenaline surged, opponents moved unpredictably, and the weight of expectation pressed down on every shoulder. Honor, courage, and loyalty were not just theoretical ideals. They were immediate requirements, tested under conditions of stress, noise, and occasionally mud-filled embarrassment. The humor of these situations often came from small human moments. A warrior stepping awkwardly over a fallen banner, misjudging distance, or realizing that the highly polished battle plan looked very different in practice. Interestingly, first battles highlighted the absurdities of war preparation. Rituals meant to impress commanders sometimes delayed action. Instructions from multiple officers occasionally contradicted each other. Even the most meticulously planned maneuvers could devolve into improvised adjustments on the fly. Yet through this chaos, the young samurai learned resilience, adaptability, and the importance of thinking independently while remaining part of a larger unit. In other words, lessons that were drilled into them from childhood. Observation, focus, and quick thinking finally revealed their full value. Despite the gravity of combat, humor persisted. The juxtaposition of years of careful, solemn preparation with unpredictable battlefield mishaps created memorable anecdotes. Imagine a young samurai who had flawlessly executed dozens of kata in the dojo, suddenly stumbling over a comrade's spear, losing a sandal, and narrowly avoiding a face-first encounter with mud, all while maintaining the stoic expression of a seasoned veteran. These moments were terrifying in real time, but they also reinforced a crucial lesson. Even in the pursuit of honor and glory, life retained its absurd, unpredictable streak. By the end of the first battle, the adolescent samurai had transformed. Theoretical knowledge and practice had merged with experience, teaching lessons that no dojo book or instructor could fully replicate. They learned that honor and survival required precision, adaptability, and calm under pressure, but also the ability to laugh at minor mishaps and acknowledge that even the most heroic warriors had awkward human moments. The good news? You've trained for years and are finally ready to fight. The bad news? Just remember to tie your sandals properly or die painfully. Life as a samurai, it turns out, is equal parts valor, discipline, and absurd attention to detail. And that first battle is a masterclass in all three. After years of wooden swords, relentless drills, poetry recitations, and first combat experiences, the young samurai finally emerges into adulthood. But the journey doesn't end at the edge of a battlefield or the completion of a kata. The true legacy of a samurai child lies in how these formative years shaped their entire life and, in a broader sense, influenced Japanese culture for generations. Childhood training left an indelible mark, creating adults capable of balancing discipline, honor, and absurd resilience. The first and most obvious legacy is discipline. Years of daily routines, strict etiquette, and precise practice cultivated a sense of order and control that carried into adulthood. A samurai who once woke before dawn to spar, memorize poetry, and polish armor could now navigate complex social hierarchies, execute strategic decisions in war, and manage household and estate affairs with the same meticulous attention to detail. This discipline was ingrained deeply, like a muscle memory of morality and focus. Even trivial tasks, tying sandals, preparing tea, or arranging a bow of rice, were approached with the same precision that once governed life and death combat exercises. Equally significant is the moral and ethical framework instilled by years of living under Bushido. Loyalty, honor, courage and righteousness weren't abstract concepts, they were second nature. Adult samurai acted with a sense of purpose, often guided by principles that had been drilled into them from childhood. Decisions were rarely impulsive, as years of training taught foresight, restraint, and the subtle consequences of one's actions. The social and professional spheres of feudal Japan were highly competitive, but a samurai's moral education allowed them to navigate these arenas effectively, balancing ambition with ethical conduct. Humor, of course, persisted. Even the most honorable adult might wince recalling the day a younger sibling tripped them with a wet kimono, proving that human absurdity never entirely disappears. Childhood also endowed samurai with mental resilience. Physical exhaustion, repeated failure, and relentless instruction during formative years built psychological fortitude. Enduring the chaos of sparring partners, heavy armor, and unpredictable battlefield conditions had taught them patience, adaptability, and the ability to recover quickly from setbacks. These qualities were invaluable in adulthood, where life could be equally unpredictable. Strategy, diplomacy, and even daily logistics demanded mental toughness, and the absurdity of early training often provided a humorous lens through which to view life's challenges. Another lasting effect was versatility. Samurai were trained in both martial and intellectual pursuits: swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, strategy, literature, calligraphy, poetry, and etiquette. This multifaceted education fostered flexibility, creativity, and balance. An adult samurai could lead troops into battle, negotiate complex agreements, compose a poem for a visiting noble, and execute tea ceremonies flawlessly, all skills that originated in the playful yet rigorous absurdities of childhood drills. Humor lingered here too. While a young samurai might have once attempted to inscribe haikus on an opponent's armor, as adults they could channel that creative energy into subtler, culturally esteemed outlets. The social legacy of childhood training was also profound. Children learned early how to observe, interpret, and respond to human behavior, a skill that translated directly into adult diplomacy, leadership, and family management. Understanding hierarchy, anticipating peer or subordinate actions, and maintaining composure under scrutiny were critical, not just for survival, but for cultivating influence. Even absurd small-scale lessons like avoiding stepping on a fallen banner or not tripping over a sibling during sparring shaped a heightened sense of awareness that served samurai well in adulthood. Culturally, the training of samurai children contributed to a lasting archetype of the disciplined, honorable, and multifaceted warrior. The image of a samurai as both artist and soldier, poet and strategist, disciplinarian and playful human, was reinforced by the absurd yet rigorous education of youth. These narratives survived in literature, theater, and folklore, establishing a template for heroism and personal conduct admired for centuries. The discipline, creativity, and moral fortitude honed in childhood became a benchmark for what it meant to live an honorable, well-rounded life in feudal Japan. Yet the humor, thankfully, never fully vanished. While an adult samurai could face death in battle with calm precision, the memories of absurd childhood moments, the sibling trips, ink-splattered calligraphy, oversized swords, and the constant balancing act of mental and physical training remained as a reminder that even the most disciplined life contains the traces of chaos, whimsy, and human imperfection. Life, after all, is more engaging when one can laugh at the ridiculous alongside the heroic. In conclusion, the legacy of a samurai child is a delicate weave of discipline, honor, resilience, versatility, and absurdity. These qualities shaped not only the individual but also the broader culture of samurai society. The rigorous and sometimes comically intense education of youth produced adults capable of greatness, yet still humble enough to remember the tiny human failures that made them relatable, adaptable, and resilient.